Once I thought I knew something, showed my hand and lost someone.
I was 32 years old when I handled the Frada case. There aren't that many times in a courtroom where kids have to testify, and you always try to avoid it. Even when they're the victim, you try to avoid it. You give the case away, you plea it out. This was different. I met you when you were just 7 years old. What do you remember about any of it? Anything?
All of it.
Do you really?
I mean, most of it, yeah.
Wow. In November of 1994, a very vivacious young lady named Farah Frada had just gotten her hair cut when she drove home, parked in her garage, and was surprised there by a man with a gun. Her neighbors heard gunshots, and Farah was evacuated by Lifeline to the hospital that night. It wasn't easy to piece together this horrible crime that left 3 young children without their mom. The investigators followed this trail that led through a whole bunch of pretty sketchy, shady characters, but it all led back to just one person. The first charges that were filed on this case made it land in my court. This was only my 6th death penalty case that I ever handled. We felt the need to use Farah's 7-year-old son on the witness stand to testify. My boss felt it was the wrong thing to do. As a brand new mother myself, and knowing how you feel about your baby, to ask any child to testify in a trial is a huge, horrible thing, maybe even scarring. Ultimately, we decided to do that. We felt like the evidence needed that to happen. This was the first big, different, crazy case that I ever handled. And a case that literally they wrote a book about, because you can't make up a case like this.
It's a Wednesday evening. My son Caleb was crying. I started to nurse him, and I'm sitting on my couch in my living room. Farah, who lived across the street, her garage door went open and the lights come on. And she's backing up into her driveway. And I hear a pop. I see Farah fall in her garage, and then I hear another pop. Immediately in my mind, I'm thinking she has boys are playing around. But I looked at my husband and said, if she doesn't get up in 2 seconds, I'm calling 911. And she didn't get up.
911 County, what is your emergency?
Yes, I just saw a shooting, please.
Okay, do you know if anybody's been shot?
Yes, I see the lady. I see her in her garage right now. She's been shot 2 times. There are 2 shots.
Passing motorist?
No, a guy in her garage waiting for her. I just saw his pants, and then I saw a black man, and he was dressed in black. And the lady's name is Farah. You need to send an ambulance. She's down.
In the midst of all of this, the lights in the garage go off. And I see this man come out from behind a tree, and he comes up to the road.
The suspect just got in the car that just pulled up. It was a silver car, I believe, with one burnt out headlight. The suspect just took off.
My husband started to go outside, and I was yelling at him not to go, but he's like, he has to check on her. He knelt down by her, and he could tell that she was still breathing, but she was shallow in her breast, like she was dying. Farah has 3 kids, and our concern is where are the kids? It was very hard to believe this was happening in our neighborhood, right in front of us.
I get the call to the crime scene. Grabbed Daniel Blomberg, who was a partner of mine. We are responding from the sheriff's office as the forensic investigation team. The initial report I get is that there is an adult female victim identified as Farah Frada. She's been shot. As I walked into the scene, garage doors open. I see the reporting deputies from the constable's office. And there's a bunch of what we in the unit call uh-oh blood. In other words, enough blood came out of the victim that it looks like she might not make it. And so at that point, the judgment is made that it's the right thing to do to fly her on the helicopter to the hospital. I get my partner started on photography, and I start looking around. I inventory the garage in the vicinity of what looks like where the crime took place. There's an automobile, there's bloodstains on the floor, there's medical refuse on the floor. I see a bunch of her property, purse and other items. And those items look like they're undisturbed. When you see that, well, it's not a robbery, most likely. I don't find any bullet casings. So kind of indicating to me they either cleaned them up or maybe used a revolver.
The first person that we want to talk to and try to rule out is the husband. We found out Robert Fratta was the husband of Farah Fratta, the woman that had been shot, but they were in the process of getting divorced.
Lots of neighbors had come out, and that's when Bob showed up. And the kids were in the car.
Bradley, the oldest, was 7, Daniel was 6, and Amber was 4 years old.
The scene was already taped off, and I just remember being approached by a lot of cops, and it was just a chaotic scene.
I went to the car and I said, Bob, don't let the kids out of the car. And Amber looked at me and she said, did something happen to my mommy? It's like they knew. That broke my heart.
That's when we start hearing something has happened. I didn't know what. I wanted to see my mother, but I was told that I couldn't see her right now. She is being transported to a hospital and that I could see her in the morning. My brother and sister were younger than me, so their reactions weren't much, but I didn't know what exactly was going on. And then when I heard that I was going to be staying with my grandparents that night, I was afraid.
At the crime scene, well, I'm talking to Robert. He was not asking questions that you would think someone would be asking when they find out that his wife and mother of his children has just been shot. He's focusing on telling the story about his alibi. Hey, I couldn't have done this. I was with my kids at church. Robert was asked to come to the homicide office for an interview. He's obviously works out. I guess you could call him a bodybuilder.
Have you ever been arrested?
No.
What type of work do you do?
Work for the city of Missouri City, combination firefighter, police officer.
You're a police officer?
Mm-hmm.
Can I see your ID?
I don't have it with me.
When one cop is interviewing another cop, they're aware that the person they're talking to knows all the rules. They know the game, they know the law, they know how to work all that to their advantage more than the typical suspect.
When you picked up your son at what time? Or your daughter, I'm sorry, Amber?
Amber was before 5 and the boys were about 5.
What'd you do with them?
Went to St. Mary's Church.
He told me that he had taken his children to church that night. He checked 2 of the children, the younger ones, into a nursery, and the oldest was preparing for his first communion.
Who hates your wife enough to?
Nobody I can think of. I mean, I can't think of anybody that hates her. All I can say is, check her lifestyle. She went out clubbing a lot, got a boob job and flaunted a lot.
It was obvious that he knew the procedures for interviews and interrogations. He was speaking freely the whole time, answering the questions and denying any involvement.
Did you arrange to have your wife killed?
No, I did not. I'll put it this way, too. I mean, if anything happens to her, what the hell am I going to do now? Me battling for custody was also relying on her to be paying me child support at $600 to $700 a month.
My interview with Robert, it just did not feel right. He didn't appear too troubled by what had just happened. It just makes me think, what is wrong with this guy? And that's just a clue that he's hiding something.
You know, I still, for some reason, I feel like she knew the person.
Robert's interview lasted 14 hours from the time he was brought down until the time he was released the next morning.
I remember Bob Fratta walking out of the sheriff's department where all the reporters are swarming him right after he's brought down to be interviewed. And he looks into that camera and does the whole, how do I look thing to the camera, like it's all a big fun game. Thinking, wow, your wife was just shot. You just took your children there and saw that, and you're up here today in your pretty blue jacket, shining for the camera.
He had an alibi, but I think Robert was involved in this somehow. He had this alternate lifestyle.
What he was doing was not normal.
That's when he decided he had to take care of Farah. She knew Farah, and she knew it was going to happen, and she didn't do one thing to stop it from happening.
The next morning, we woke up to my grandmother waking us up in bed and telling us that our mother had died. There wasn't anything after that she would say that happened. She didn't tell us that my mother was murdered. I did not know exactly what happened. I did not know that she was shot, but I knew that she was no longer with us. And after that, probably for the next 2-3 hours, we just stayed in that bed and all cried.
So Lex and Betty Bacher, Farah's parents, took their grandchildren and they gave these 3 kids a home.
During the investigation, we spoke to some of Farah's friends so we could get a better idea of what was going on within the family.
I met Farah working at American Airlines. I actually worked in the office and she was a ticket agent. We were very good friends. We talked every day. Farah was very quiet, very shy. She's just sweet, good person. Farah's family came here from the UK. She started working for American Airlines, and that's how she met Bob. He was a ticket agent too, and they seemed to hit it off. He could charm the pants off anybody. They had a great time together. They had 3 beautiful kids, and they were happy. It didn't start falling apart till later. It took a while because Bob put up a good front, but he was actually very selfish, all about him, even when it came to the kids. And then Bob was abusive to Farah, but not physically. He knew her weaknesses. Bob knew that Farah was insecure about her body. He latched onto her insecurities and made them worse. I mean, it's one of the reasons why she got breast implants.
So then she not only just wanted to divorce him, she wanted the kids and custody, him to pay child support. They were fighting over 3 children, and they were fighting over the money and property. During the divorce, Farah was deposed, and some really nasty, ugly things had finally been spoken publicly about Bob Fratta for the first time.
The divorce proceedings revealed that Robert had this alternate lifestyle. That he would go to some seedy areas of Houston, that he liked to frequent topless clubs, leather bars, that sort of thing. He preferred very kinky sex.
That kind of sex is what he really liked, and he wanted her to do that. And she had told other people she was disgusted by it and couldn't do it anymore. She was ready for that part of her life to be over with.
A lot of Robert's life revolved around the gym. So we spoke to people at the gym. We found out that Robert was telling them about the difficulties he was having at home. He would also tell them how he was getting ready to lose everything because of this divorce. Robert was not happy about it, that he was concerned that he would not have any money, that he would be broke, that he would have to pay child support. And that's when we found out that he was asking people if they knew anybody that would kill her for him.
Law enforcement learned Bob Fratta approached a lot of people about, do you know somebody that can kill my wife? Hey, I got some extra money. Do you want to kill my wife? No one knew how serious to take him.
Most people that knew Bob knew he talked a lot. They thought that he was not serious about it, that he was blowing steam. When we found out that Robert's alibi was at St. Mary's, we went there and questioned employees and other people that were at the church that night. We found out that he was acting very strange. Getting up to make phone calls. It got to the point where employees of the church were getting angry with him because he was answering the phone instead of letting church staff answer the phone, like he was expecting phone calls.
Law enforcement talked to Bradley. Bradley had a great memory. Bradley remembered that night that Daddy was on the phone at church, that Daddy didn't usually even come into church when they went to catechism, but he did that night.
We asked for the toll records from St. Mary's. I wanted to see who he was calling or who was calling into the church.
Bradley remembered that Bob took all three of the kids to Wyatt's cafeteria after church. He even remembered his daddy using the payphone there.
While eating there, 2 times at least, to my knowledge, left us sitting in the booth and went to a payphone to make phone calls.
When we received the toll records from St. Mary's, a woman named Mary Gipp came up. We found out that calls were being made from the church to Mary Gipp's phone and from Mary Gipp's phone to the church. And also calls were going to a pager, which was registered to Mary Gipp.
The detectives were also able to identify calls made from Mary Gipp's phone to Wyatt's cafeteria that night.
And the calls were coming in about the time that Farah was killed.
The question is, who's Mary Gipp? And could she be involved with the murder of Farah Fratta?
Mary Gipp was contacted by detectives and questioned, but Mary was reluctant to talk. She did not offer any information about calls with Robert Fratta the night of the murder.
The detectives know that her phone is involved around the time of the murder, but they don't really know what that means. She didn't want to admit she knew anything. She balked, she stalled, she did everything she could to avoid helping law enforcement. But there's nothing to arrest her for at this point. So the detectives needed to figure out a way to get Mary Gipp to want to talk to him.
We found out that calls from Robert Fratta during the time that this murder occurred were going to a phone and to a pager registered to Mary Gipp. But Mary was reluctant to talk about the murder.
If you think someone really does know more information, you can play the hardball game where you threaten to take them to a grand jury, threaten to file charges. So in exchange for immunity, Mary Gipp agrees to tell the sheriff's department everything she knows, to cooperate completely, and to testify. She tells them that she's in a serious relationship with a man named Joe Price-Stash. They were living together in an apartment. She then says that Bob and Joe Price-Stash met at the gym, where she also went. They all knew each other. And that at some point, Bob Fratta approached Joe Price-Stash at that gym about, do you know somebody that can kill my wife?
We learned from Mary Gipp that he was offered $2,000 in a Jeep to do it. Joseph Price-Stash agreed to carry out the murder.
But the sheriff's office knew that Joe Price-Stash wasn't going to be the shooter because the shooter is a black male. Joe Price-Stash was the getaway driver because he drove his car that night that had a burnt-out headlight. Mary Gipp told the sheriff's department that their neighbor, Howard Guidry, was the person who shot Farah Fratta. Mary Gipp knew it was about to go down, yet she didn't call one person and warn them. Not Farah, not the police, not anybody. She let it happen.
Mary Gipp told us that after the murder, Price-Stash came back home and brought the weapon. During that time, Mary wrote down the serial number of the weapon, which was a .38 revolver. And she decides, hey, my insurance for me to stay out of trouble is to jot down this information.
4 months after the murder, law enforcement discovers the serial number was linked to a .38 Smith & Wesson, and law enforcement already had the gun in evidence.
In March of '95, there was a robbery at the Klein Bank.
Howard Guidry was involved in the Klein Bank robbery. He got caught and arrested, and he had that gun in his backpack. which led to being able to identify that weapon as being the murder weapon that killed Farrah Fradda. They run the serial number on the gun through ATF, and it comes back registered to Bob Fradda.
On March 8th, 1995, Howard Guidry was brought to the office for an interview and gave a full confession. Price Stash gave him the gun. The plan was to drop him off at the Fradda house, wait until Farrah came home and shoot her, and that Price Stash would come pick him up and they would make their getaway.
Joe Price Stash was arrested. He was brought in and interviewed, and he admitted his involvement. We have the murder weapon. We have Mary Gipp. We know of the involvement of Joe Price Stash and Howard Guidry. We know that Bob Fradda is the one pulling all the strings and masterminding all this. It's time to get all three of them indicted for capital murder because it's a murder for hire. A murder for hire is a special kind of murder under Texas law, and anyone involved, middleman, triggerman, hirer, are all guilty of the same thing, capital murder, and they can all three get the death penalty.
I was on the couch playing a board game. My grandparents were watching the news, and all of a sudden my father pops up on TV in handcuffs. I still at that time did not know it was because of what he did to my mother. What I felt at that time was curiousness. Why is it going on?
Bob Fradda, Joe Price Stash, and Howard Guidry were all indicted for the capital murder of Farrah Fradda. I was a chief in the 230th District Court. I was a pretty new chief. I was only 32 years old. I was pregnant with my second child. This turned out to be the 6th death penalty case that I handled. So I was new, I was young, I was just learning everything back then. So you have 3 defendants. Often, prosecutors would pick to try the shooter first. In most people's minds, they're the worst one. In my mind, the worst person here is Bob Fradda. He's the mastermind and he's a cop. We tried Bob Fradda first. We went into it knowing his would be the most difficult, though the evidence wasn't as obvious and simple for him because he's not the shooter. So the case against Bob Fradda was circumstantial. You don't have a confession. There was no videotape. There was no eyewitness. And that was the risk. That was the concern. Bob Fradda's on trial for the murder of his wife, Farrah Fradda. My job is to show the jury that divorce is the motive and to try and make them see the pieces of the story that prove that Bob, even though he wasn't there that night and he truly was alibied, was in charge of the whole thing that went down. The thing that I think drove Bob over the edge to find someone to kill his wife is that in their very nasty divorce, Farrah was deposed in a law office, not in a courtroom. And for the first time, she acknowledged what was going on in their sex life, things that he made her do, and that he's a sexual deviant.
We found out that Robert preferred to have people defecating on him during sex.
Bob was sick. What he was doing was not normal. She just couldn't handle it. Nobody could handle something like that.
So Bob and Farrah Fradda were fighting over custody of the 3 kids. They were fighting over money, and I think Bob Fradda was worried that his sexual desires were about to be made very, very public. That's when he decided he had to take care of Farrah. Bob Fradda had what a lot of people would call the perfect alibi. Catechism class for his kids during the window of the time of the murder. Bradley was 7, Daniel was 6, and Amber was 4. Even though there were other witnesses and ladies at the church that saw Bob Fradda that night, the only people that were with Bob Fradda the entire night were his 3 children. So my boss at the time, Casey O'Brien, and I went round and round about, but do we put his 7-year-old son on the witness stand in front of the jury to talk about his dad, who he loved, What would a jury think? Would they be so mad at us for doing that they wouldn't do their job? I didn't think so. In case you just felt it was the wrong thing to do. But Bob Fratta's never going to testify, so how am I going to prove Bob Fratta was taking all those phone calls at St. Mary's and Wyatt's Cafeteria that very night? Bradley was there, which is why we called him as a witness. He was so little, and he sits up there on the chair, and where do you think he looked? At his dad. And he looked at his dad almost the whole time. He would look over at me and answer the questions, but it was the first time he'd seen his dad in a very long time because Bob was in custody, and he didn't know what all this means. I doubt he knew that he was testifying against his father. The prosecutor part of me was coldly thinking, let's focus here. The mother part of me wanted to cry and just yank him off and take him out. I mean, look what he'd been through. He buried his mom, his life has changed, he's now living with his grandparents. He has no parents, and now he's testifying in a courtroom. Doesn't get worse than that. But he's answering my questions, and he remembered everything with hardly any hesitation or confusion. Bradley's testimony is the connecting dot between all the phone calls that Bob Fratta made that night from the church and from Wyatt's Cafeteria. The phone records show that those calls were all made from Bob Fratta to Joe Pricedash, who was using Mary Gipp's phone while he was with Howard Guidry on the night of the murder. We were able to match up 2 phone calls that went to the Wyatt's Cafeteria where Bob Fratta was the night of the murder. One call came before the shooting and one came after. The defense didn't have a lot of cross-examination questions for Bradley. There's no way anybody could ever think that he was making it up or lying, not in that little boy voice the way he said it. And I think that he broke the jury's heart. Hi, Bradley.
I can.
Can I give you a hug?
Yeah, absolutely.
You still look the same.
You do
really
too. You look better.
Wow, you look so good. You look so young.
Thank you.
I was really dreading seeing Bradley. I wondered for so many years, how's he doing? How's he really doing? And I never reached out to him because I appreciate that anything having to do with me is a reminder of the worst thing in his life. I still, to this day, wonder how much impact that had on Bradley psychologically, or how he grew up dealing with the fact that he testified against his own father. We took a lot of criticism in Black for putting you on the stand.
I bet you did.
Having to go through all that as a baby, 7 years old.
I had no idea why I was answering these questions for you.
Right.
I had no idea that my dad was the one being charged, so I'm pretty sure I smiled at him when I looked at him.
And you went like this?
Yep, I remember I waved.
The crucial part of connecting your dad to the scene was all those phone calls.
Yes, ma'am. I remember being at church that night. I remember him walking away from us multiple times to use the phone. I remember specifically 2 times at Wyatt's Cafe, him leaving us at the booth that we were at to go use the payphone.
Did you ever, in the years since then, when you got older, wonder why legally we made you do that, I made you do that? Did you ever wonder that?
It was needed, I know it. All I want was justice for my mother, and I wanted the truth. And if that had to come out from me for people to know as well, then that's how it had to be. I appreciate you, is what I want you to know out of anything.
You're very sweet.
I said I wasn't gonna cry, but...
So did I. You mean a lot to a lot of us.
You mean a lot to my family. Thank you.
In most of the solicitations of capital murders that I've handled, the mastermind had to ask around a little bit or talk about it a little bit. Bob Fratta had a big mouth, and he was braggadocious. And at the gym is where he talked the most. He would try to get other people to help him out taking care of his wife. And we put those people on the stand, too. The defense countered, said it was literally locker room talk. All men say that about their wives when they're going through a divorce. Oh, come on, he was just kidding. But he did it to too many people, including at work where he was a cop, so that didn't really play. In every murder case, you have to put on someone who knows the victim to talk about the circumstances going on in Farah's life at that time. We already knew that we couldn't use Farah's dad because he was too angry. He lost his baby. He was mad. And we didn't think that Lex could keep it cool. We thought the safer play was to put Betty Backer on the stand, Farah's mom, because we thought she could handle it a little better. Betty gets on the stand. She's looking into the eyes of her son-in-law who killed her baby. And she lost it. Betty starts screaming at Bob and calling him a monster. The defense stands up, starts screaming, mistrial, mistrial. They're objecting. The judge is yelling at the jury, take him out, take him out. Oh boy, here we go. We put Betty Backer on the stand, Farah's mom, and she immediately starts screaming at Bob and calling him a monster. The defense stands up, starts screaming, mistrial, mistrial. It's bad, but you got to remember poor Betty. When Bob Frada got arrested, she saw it on TV. She's never been able to confront him with the knowledge that he killed her baby. And I'm trying to tell her, you got to be cool. You can't cry. Just answer my questions. Don't be rude. All the rules that we ask them to follow, they're hard. I really wonder how any family can ever keep it together. I'm pretty sure I would lose it. I'd be one of those people coming over the railing trying to get you. The judge yelled at her. He yelled at me, but denied the motion for a mistrial, told us to straighten it up, and we started again. After we set up the weeks and days that led to Farah Frada's murder, we get to the actual plan that they actually carried out the day of the murder. It was important for the jury to understand that Bob, even though he wasn't there that night, was in charge of the whole thing that went down. And Joe Price-Dash, at the time his serious girlfriend, was Mary Gibb. She is a hugely important witness for this case. In Texas, you need to be guilty of helping commit the offense of capital murder. Mary Gibb didn't do that. She was aware it was going on, but she did not help the capital murder happen. She's the connect-the-dot witness between Joe Price-Dash to Howard Guidry to Bob Frada. Mary Gibb made me sick. I couldn't stand her. She knew Farah, and she knew it was going to happen, and she didn't do one thing to stop it from happening. You try to always judge your witness through the lens of a juror, because that's what counts, their vote. A juror doesn't care about my legal requirements. They just know how they feel. So I appreciated a jury's going to hate her. And I said that in opening statement. My line was, you're going to meet a lady that you can't stand. She's going to make you sick to your stomach, and she's going to disgust you. Even if you hate her, you still have to believe her. The main thing we were worried about was, does she come across as credible enough for a jury to believe she's telling the truth? Mary Gibb testifies that on November the 9th, 1994, she sees Joe Price-Dash get dressed all in black, walk out the door, and tells her he's going to go pick up Howard Guidry. She knows why they're leaving and what they're leaving for. She remembers that Joe Price-Dash comes back home. He tells her it's done. He had that gun, that .38, so she was able to write down the serial number to that .38 that was used because she knew that what they were doing was wrong. And she anticipated that one day law enforcement was going to need that information.
There's one person that I will never, ever forgive, and that's Mary Gibb.
I understand.
I know that she knew what was going to happen.
And she didn't do a damn thing.
She didn't do a damn thing.
She didn't pick up the phone and call anybody, and she didn't try to stop it. And she has to live with it every day, knowing what a horrible, selfish, weak person she is.
I guess that's punishment enough.
I think her life has been pretty horrible ever since that day. All the consequences, right?
Yeah.
Her whole life is different because of it.
Yeah.
When Mary Gibb testified, the defense was kind of in a quandary because they wanted to attack her character with the whole, you're a lousy human being because you knew this was going to happen and you did nothing. But if you do that, you're acknowledging that everybody knew it was going to happen and they still participated in it. They also tried to discredit her because she stayed with Joe Price-Dash even after she knew what he did and what he was capable of. The defense cross-examination wasn't effective enough to undermine her credibility, in my opinion. So when she got off the witness stand, I remember thinking, yes, she did a good job. The defense's final argument was a compilation of all of our evidence is just circumstantial, and they tried to undermine the credibility of Mary Gipp. They made the argument that that night at church, when his alibi was catechism for the kids and he was on the phone a lot, what's the big deal? Bob's always on the phone. That doesn't mean he was communicating about her murder that night. And the most important argument they made is that because there was an eyewitness to the shooting, we all know that Bob Fratto wasn't the shooter because that was a black male. In our closing argument, we were telling the jury again why we put on each and every witness and what the point of their testimony was. We talked about the divorce and the trigger, the fact that the world is fixing to know what a sick bastard Bob Fratto is, in addition to the custody and all the rest of his controlling issues. And in the whole wide world, who in the world will want Farrah Fratto dead but Bob? If you're not the trigger man, but you provide the weapon, you're assisting. If you're encouraging someone to do it by giving them money like Bob Fratto, that makes you a party, an accomplice. We want the jury to understand that even though he wasn't there and he was smart enough to use some fools to do it for him, don't let him get away with it. He's the puppeteer here. He's the mastermind here. Hold him accountable. He's guilty of capital murder. The jury goes out to deliberate guilt. If Bob Fratto is not found guilty, then what do you do with the other two? After less than 2 hours of deliberation, the jury found Robert Fratto guilty of capital murder. It is always satisfying when a jury comes to such a quick verdict because they see the evidence the same way we do.
I was not in court when the verdict came in. I'm at my grandparents' house, and my grandfather comes with my grandmother and sits all three of us down, and he proceeds to tell us that our father is responsible for our mother's death, and that our father was going to be going away as well. We were never going to see him again. I couldn't process my father had someone kill my mother. I still looked at my father like he's my father, you know, and I'm still trying to understand why or if this is even real. But at that time, I turned on my father. He was responsible for my mother's death. He's behind bars, and anger came towards him, and just basically running through my mind with the question, why?
Now, to me, the real trial begins. Was he going to get the ultimate punishment in the state of Texas? And that's the death penalty.
The same jury is asked to go back there and vote. Does the defendant get the death penalty by answering these questions? Is he a future threat? And is life more warranted than the death penalty? Here was the challenge in this case. Bob Fratto was not the shooter. And him being a cop and a first offender, would that make just one juror decide, okay, he doesn't need the death penalty? And if they decided that one juror, then we've lost the death penalty. The jury came back with a punishment verdict, and it didn't take them very long.
It was a bittersweet moment for the family of Farrah Fratto. On this day, family members watched as her husband was sentenced to die for arranging the murder.
The heinousness of this crime, the planning and the premeditation and the kind of man that he is, he deserved the death penalty.
Besides just knowing that he's guilty, what about the fact that his punishment was the death penalty?
I liked it at first when I was younger. As I grew older, I thought, you know, I don't care if he would just sit in jail for the rest of his life, to be honest with you.
In 1994, we did not have life without parole. So had your dad gotten a life sentence, it would have been a life sentence for 1 day. He would have been eligible for parole. So that was the choice the jury had, life and death, okay? The next case we tried was Joe Price-Dash's, and his jury also gave him the death penalty. The last case we tried was Howard Guidry's case, and again, the jury gave him the death penalty. Every single person involved in committing this crime received the death penalty, and that's the only case that I know of in the United States of America where that's happened. What do you remember about your mom?
I have specific memories that I can remember You know, us going to the pool or her working out, just little things.
Remember how pretty she was?
Yeah.
Okay. At one point, you tried to, like, reach out to your dad and talk to him,
I
okay?
went and saw him, my brother and I.
When?
When I was 18, and my brother was 16 or 17.
So y'all went to death row to see him?
Uh-huh.
Wow, tell me about that.
I just wanted to hear, maybe he would confess to me.
Or
maybe
say he's sorry.
Sorry or anything, but he just constantly wanted to say he's innocent.
How much time did your dad spend asking about y'all?
It wasn't much.
Okay.
I mean, it was honestly just him trying to convince us that he's behind bars for no reason.
I've never been to an execution. You went, huh?
As long as I can remember, I knew I wanted to go.
Did he say anything to you?
Nothing.
He didn't?
No.
Did he say anything at all?
They asked him if he had any last words, and he said no.
Really?
That was it.
Okay. Wow.
I think I really have one question for you. Like, you are 100% certain it was Bob.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. That's all I wanted to ask you.
Bradley.
That's it.
There's no doubt about it. When Bradley asked, "Are you sure my dad did it?" I tried not to let it show on my face, but I was like, I wanted to cry and I wanted to scream. Deep down in his heart, he's still that little boy whose daddy killed his mom. And that's a horrible thing to have to accept, and you just don't want to ever believe it, do you? Thank you. Tell your brother and sister and grandma and Zane, okay? I'm proud of you.
Thank you.
Your mom will be very proud of
I know. I know she is. Thank you, Kelly.
Yes, you're
Thank you for
welcome.
everything.
Thank you. I learned so much from this horrible crime. I learned about what divorces do to people. And also, everybody knows that most cops are there for the right reason. But this case reminds us all that there are bad cops. And when you have a bad cop, that can be a really difficult case to have to handle. This case, too, reminds you when people say things like, "Hey, do you know anybody that'll help me kill my wife?" Take it seriously. Call them out on it. Do something. If one of those people that Bob Bratta popped off to had said something, Farrah would still be alive today.
In Hollywood, a dead man isn't who he appears to be, and someone just walked away with $1 million insurance benefit. Now, forensics must prove that murder was part of the package. A police officer kills his wife in a freak car accident, but investigators believe he may have been driven to homicide. A simple farmer stands accused of murdering his brother, and a town rallies to his defense. So does forensic science. They look death in the face every day of their lives. From fragments of bone, drops of blood, and slivers of tissue, they can piece together the shattered circumstances that bring the deceased to their labs. Every body has a story to tell, and each is a page in the coroner's casebook. When someone dies, their work begins. Coroners, medical examiners, and criminalists know that every kind of death leaves its subtle mark. And they know murder when they see it. Early in the morning of April 16, 1988, the Glendale, California 911 dispatcher received a call about a man in cardiac arrest. The call was placed by Dr. Richard Boggs, a respected neurologist. When paramedics arrived at his office, he explained that the man was one of his patients named Gene Hansen, who had a history of heart trouble. The victim had credit cards in Hansen's name. Before he called 911, Dr. Boggs said he'd done all he could to revive his patient, but nothing worked. Gene Hansen was declared dead at the scene. At the LA County Coroner's Office, the body was given a routine autopsy. The office sees 200 bodies each day, and this one was just another face in the crowd. Seeing no immediate cause of death except for a few marks on the heart, the coroner deferred to the diagnosis of the victim's personal physician, Dr. Boggs. Hansen's cause of death was listed as heart failure due to a dangerous heart condition. The body was released to the hands of John Hawkins, Hansen's companion and his partner in their successful sportswear business. He flew to California from Ohio to claim the remains. He had them cremated in respect for Hansen's last request. Hawkins, as his partner's sole beneficiary, then received the first million of Hansen's $1.5 million life insurance policy. Usually, that would be the end of the story. But this story was just getting started. 5 months after the death, an insurance agent was closing Hansen's file when she noticed something strange. The face on Hansen's autopsy photo didn't resemble the photo supplied by the Department of Motor Vehicles. To double check, she requested that the thumbprint on file at the DMV be compared with the one from the autopsy. No doubt about it. These were two different men. And that raised two vital questions. Where was the real Hansen, and who was the dead man? The agent had uncovered something a lot more serious than insurance fraud. Though they're situated next to each other, the difference between Glendale, California and North Hollywood is like night and day. But this is where Glendale police went to solve the mystery of the dead man who wasn't Gene Hansen. Police determined from fingerprints and missing persons reports that the man was really a bookkeeper named Ellis Green. He was last seen leaving a bar in North Hollywood on April 15th. The next day, he was declared dead under an assumed name in Dr. Boggs's office. Sergeant John Perkins of the Glendale Police tried to sort out what happened.
A photograph of Ellis Green's body that was depicted in the doctor's office was taken to his elderly aunt, and that photo was shown to her. She identified that as being Ellis Green, her nephew. Now we knew we had the real body, the real name, but we still didn't have an exact or approximate cause of death.
Demonstrating how Green died was only half the task before him. Investigators also had to prove that the real Gene Hansen was still alive. By now, months had passed. If Hansen were alive, he had an enormous head start to find a hiding place. John Hawkins, his partner in this elaborate insurance scam, had also vanished, along with $1 million of insurance money.
Michael Button, John Perkins.
Police concentrated on the last person to see the victim alive, Dr. Boggs.
Hello, officers. I'm Dr. Boggs. What can I do for you?
Police paid a visit to him to find out about the man who died in his office. Boggs told them that he'd been a patient for years. Boggs knew him only as Melvin Eugene Hansen, or Gene. He had no reason to suspect it was an assumed name. Faced with a search warrant, he handed over his patient's files. Sergeant Perkins examined them. It was possible that Dr. Boggs was telling the truth. Gene Hansen's records showed that he'd been repeatedly warned about his condition, but refused to follow doctor's orders. But it was also possible that Dr. Boggs was in on this elaborate insurance scam, and the records themselves were doctored. Perkins pulled 3 EKG strips, dated several months apart. He wondered if they truly demonstrated the life-threatening heart condition that supposedly killed Green. He asked a cardiologist to analyze the EKGs. The heart specialist told him that they indicated a mild, common condition that wasn't fatal. Perkins was more suspicious than ever that Dr. Boggs had intentionally faked the records. But he couldn't prove it. Then he found the answer was right on the EKG strips. Simple enough for even a layman to understand.
Late one night, I was sitting at my desk and I'm looking at these EKG strips and I'm going through them and I'm looking at them and suddenly it became very obvious. One was completely clean. One had a red dye halfway down the length of the EKG strip, and the other one had a complete dye from the entire length of the EKG strip. And you suddenly think, wait a minute, these are all connected. So I put them up on the desk and put them end to end, and sure enough, the fractures matched perfectly.
The red markings signaling the end of the roll formed one continuous darkening line across 2 of the 3 strips, allowing Perkins to put them into sequential order. But when he did so, the dates that Boggs wrote on the back of the strips were out of order and months apart.
These were fabricated EKG strips.
While Perkins was making his discovery, the case was progressing on a different front.
You want to check this area in here, and I'll go in the kitchen and check. Okay.
Police were following the trail of Ellis Green's credit card purchases. The dead man's cards were still active and still in use. Investigators weren't sure who was using them, but they hoped it was the real Gene Hansen. They tracked the card to a bungalow on Key West, Florida. The rental agent confirmed that the tenant was a man named Ellis Green. He had moved out weeks earlier, and the apartment hadn't been rented since. Detectives looked for any clues that could reveal the identity of the former occupant. On a glass in a cabinet, they found one, a fingerprint. It matched Gene Hansen's. Now they had proof that he was alive.
Sir, could you ever see
Then, in January 1989, 9 months after his reported death, Gene Hansen, traveling under another assumed name, was stopped at the Dallas-Fort Worth airport returning from Mexico. He'd been acting eccentrically enough for customs agents to pull him over and inspect his suitcases. They found $14,000 in cash that he failed to declare, thereby breaking the law. They also found the IDs for 13 people. Among them was Ellis Green's, the dead man in Dr. Boggs' office. Here was proof that he'd switched identities with the victim and pocketed some of his own death benefits. He was arrested. With Gene Hansen captured and the incriminating EKG strips, police had enough to arrest Boggs as well. They knew they had him for conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. In fact, they uncovered evidence that he and Hansen had pulled off some fraudulent claims in the past. The 2 of them, along with John Hawkins, staged car accidents for the insurance money. Dr. Boggs was the physician who signed off on their medical claims. But was there enough evidence to prove that Boggs actually murdered Ellis Green as part of the conspiracy? Without a body, they didn't seem to have much of a case. Boggs claimed that they originally hoped to steal a body from the morgue, but that proved impossible. Then, by gruesome coincidence, the conspirators said they happened upon Ellis Green's body shortly after he died. Despite how unlikely the story sounded, Boggs challenged the prosecution to prove he was lying. Glendale Police Sergeant John Perkins had to somehow turn an elaborate insurance scam into a case of homicide. Gene Hansen, the man who faked his own death, and Richard Boggs, the accommodating physician, were already in custody. Perkins was eager to put all the pieces together and wrap it up, but there was still no sign of John Hawkins, the beneficiary who fled with the $1 million insurance payout. And still, investigators were short on evidence to prove what they strongly suspected, that Dr. Boggs murdered Ellis Green to pass him off as Gene Hansen.
We really needed somebody who could look at the entire pieces of evidence that we had, that being the autopsy report, some of the tissues. There was a stomach content that was collected at the time of autopsy, and examine those from an independent view, to look at the crime scene photos, to give us some indication as to this person did not die of natural causes. And that's when we brought in Dr. Michael Baden.
Michael Baden is the executive director of the New York State Police Forensic Science Unit. He's also an expert on the nuances that death leaves on the body. He has worked on the congressional committees that investigated the deaths of John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King, Jr. In the case of Ellis Green, Baden had slides of his heart, lung, and liver tissue, as well as photographs of the victim that were taken shortly after death. From this evidence, Baden could determine two facts with confidence. One, Green did not have a fatal heart condition, and two, his skin, which showed no other marks, was blue at the time of death, suggesting lack of oxygen. From these two facts, Baden reached a single conclusion: Green was suffocated. Except for the telltale blue color, in the absence of a struggle, suffocation leaves no marks. Its diagnosis comes from eliminating all other possible causes of death. It's a diagnosis of exclusion.
A bullet wound, we don't need a diagnosis of exclusion because we find a hole in the body. A stab wound or a blow from a baseball bat all leave marks on the body that we can see at autopsy. But if something is put over the nose and mouth, causing a person to die because he or she can't breathe, and then that object is removed, a hand or a pillow, at the autopsy there's no specific finding that's going to say that he was suffocated.
The evidence was enough to convince a jury that the three men had planned the crime together, and that Dr. Boggs, the healer, was Dr. Boggs, a killer.
These three individuals were not strangers to crime. They had hooked up probably 4 years before this particular murder, and they had worked out different ways of committing insurance fraud. And the plan that they evolved was somebody had to die. That person, they agreed, was to be Gene Hansen. And the only way that they could pull this thing off was with a doctor, and that doctor was Dr. Boggs.
Police believe that Boggs picked Ellis Green up at a bar, the last place he had been seen. He bought him some drinks to make him more compliant. The victim's blood alcohol content was well above the legal limit. Then, Boggs lured him to his office. Just in case the victim was still sober enough to fight back, Boggs may have incapacitated him with a stun gun. Then the victim was smothered without putting up a fight. Perkins believes that the forensic pathologist's determination of murder made this case winnable.
Dr. Bodden's testimony in this particular case, I feel, was that last inning, you're down by 2 and bases are loaded, and Dr. Bodden came in and basically hit a home run for us.
In 1990, Richard Boggs was found guilty of first-degree murder and fraud. He was sentenced to life without possibility of parole. It took 3 years and a worldwide manhunt before police caught up with John Hawkins on the island of Sardinia. In 1995, both he and Melvin Eugene Hansen were convicted of fraud, grand theft, and conspiracy to commit murder. Hansen was given life without parole. Hawkins received 25 years to life. The work of the medical examiner undermined the murderous conspiracy of Gene Hansen and his cohorts. But whether a crime is ingenious or devilishly simple, the forensics required to solve it is equally complex. On the rainy night of November 27, 1992, just after 9:30 p.m., a passing motorist reported what looked like an accident on Hawaii's Volcano Highway. Police arrived to find a van facing the wrong way, apparently after spinning. The responding officer recognized the owner of the van to be Ken Matheson, a sergeant on the police force. Ken was badly shaken up. His wife, Yvonne, fared much worse. Ken had tended to her in the back of the van until help arrived. She had lost a lot of blood. By strange coincidence, Yvonne Matheson was a nurse who helped deliver the responding officer's first child weeks before. Paramedics moved her into the ambulance to rush her to the hospital at Hilo. The hospital where she worked became the place where she died. When Ken Matheson's fellow officers heard about the incident on the police radio, they went to see him at the hospital. Matheson told one of his colleagues that his wife's death was a terrible accident. She was driving the van when they started to fight. Things escalated. Enraged beyond reason, Yvonne jumped out of the open window of the moving van. Ken said he slid over to steer the vehicle, then backed up to look for his wife. That's when he ran over her. Yvonne and Ken Matheson had once been divorced, but then decided to give their marriage a second chance. It seemed to be working this time, give or take the usual rough spots. Then, this tragedy destroyed it all. According to Hilo police, any accident that results in death is considered negligent homicide. For this misdemeanor, Matheson could expect a maximum fine of $1,000 and a year in jail. At the least, he'd be fined $100 or be sentenced to 100 hours of community service.
Don't worry.
In any case, he'd be able to keep his badge. He didn't protest the charges. As in any sudden death, a complete investigation would have to be conducted. It was a formality. The death of Yvonne Matheson was unfortunate and tragic, but police had no reason to doubt Ken's story. While the investigation was underway, Matheson stayed on active duty with the police force. But after inspecting the scene of the accident, Hawaii County Police noticed some minor inconsistencies between the roadside evidence and Matheson's story. At first, they seemed hardly worth mentioning. Each year, tourists flock to Hawaii to escape the cares of their daily lives. The sun, the surf, and the primal fiery beauty of the volcanoes exert their cleansing influence. For Hawaii's inhabitants, life in paradise goes on just like anywhere else. Crimes are committed, accidents happen, and investigators are charged with determining which is which. In Hilo, traffic investigators inspected the area where the wife of Sergeant Ken Matheson lost her life. They found relatively little blood on the highway compared to what was found in the van. Though it was a little peculiar, they wrote it off to the rain and the fact that Ken Matheson had rushed his dying wife into the van after he struck her. At the police impoundment lot, the van had its own story to tell. It was routine procedure for a vehicle involved in a fatal accident to undergo a mechanical inspection. It negates any future defense claims of faulty equipment. Police also had to be sure the van was safe to drive before they could release it to Matheson. Because of the nature of this accident, the undercarriage was thoroughly inspected. Hawaii County Police traffic investigator Martin Elazar was surprised by the relative lack of damage he found there. However, when he was done inspecting the outside, the interior of the van caught his interest.
I peered inside from the outside and I could see blood stains. Blood stains on the driver's side window, blood stains on the plastic cover to the panel area fronting the steering wheel. Blood stains up above there. There's a heavy concentration of blood and hair on that bolt.
There was no reason for blood to be in the driver's portion of the vehicle. Elazar needed a closer look, but to search inside the van required a warrant. He asked Deputy Attorney General Kurt Spohn to request one. The warrant came through in the nick of time. 3 months had passed since the incident. According to Spohn, their main piece of evidence almost slipped through their fingers.
You do a mechanical inspection, and once all the mechanical inspections and the search warrants are finished, you return the van to the owner. And in this case, the van was authorized to be returned to the owner.
Fortunately, Matheson hadn't picked it up yet. The van was secure. The release authorization was canceled. A search warrant for the van's interior was issued. Now, Spohn had to face the dismal possibility that Sergeant Matheson's story might be a lie. And though they still had the van, another piece of vital evidence was lost forever.
We decided that this case was possibly more than a negligent homicide, and because of that, we decided we should probably have a forensic pathologist do an autopsy in this case. However, at that time, we found out that the body had been cremated.
Yvonne Matheson's body had been autopsied 3 days after her death. On the island of Hawaii, the coroner is also the chief of police. A pathologist from a nearby hospital is retained as a consultant. The pathologist was told that the death was accidental. But a pathologist specializes in natural causes of death, such as disease. Even so, he could tell that the victim's injuries didn't jibe with Ken Matheson's account. The The pathologist noted injuries to the victim's head, arms, and hands that weren't consistent with being run over or tumbling out of the vehicle. But the interpretation of these injuries lay outside the scope of the consulting pathologist's training. It was really a job for a forensic pathologist who specializes in death by unnatural causes. Still, puzzled by his findings, the pathologist was sure to photograph every aspect of the victim and to take tissue samples. Now that the victim had been cremated, they were all that was left. A tragic accident case was now turning ugly. Spohn knew there was enough cause to open a homicide investigation, but without a body, there might not be enough evidence to resolve it. The original pathologist's photos and the evidence from the van would have to be enough. He braced himself for the inevitable public outcry.
In some ways, it's kind of a no-win situation. If you investigate and find out that the police officer is innocent and you announce that, everybody says, well, it's swept under the rug because this is a police officer. And if you investigate the case and you find out that the officer is guilty and you charge him, everybody says you're only charging him because you're buckling under to public pressure and he's actually innocent.
Sure enough, 6 months into the investigation, widespread criticism forced Sergeant Ken Matheson's superiors to put him on desk duty while he remained a suspect. The press coverage brought to light an intriguing incident. A witness who read about the case in the papers told investigators that on the night of the accident, he stopped to help shortly after 9 p.m. As he pulled over, a man, possibly Ken Matheson, stepped from the back of the van and shined a flashlight in his eyes. He told the Samaritan that no one was injured and that the police had already been called. Then he sent him away. Investigators now suspected that perhaps the passerby interrupted the crime in progress. They just had to prove it.
Martin, one of the interesting things about...
In Hawaii, Deputy Attorney General Kurt Spohn faced the unhappy task of investigating Sergeant Ken Matheson for murder. To find out more about the blood spatter in the driver's area of Matheson's van, he asked a colleague to locate the best blood spatter expert in the country.
Approximately a 28-mile drive. A couple of days later, he told me that it was someone by the name of Dr. Henry Lee, who was the head of the Connecticut State Forensics Laboratory.
Henry Lee, who is now Commissioner of the state's Department of Public Safety, uses the laws of physics to uphold the laws of justice. His expertise is reading clues written in blood.
That's called medium velocity.
He's not afraid to get his hands dirty in the process. Like any substance, blood is affected by gravity and momentum. Every kind of bloodshed leaves behind characteristic clues. Stabbing will create a dripping pattern. The relatively low velocity of the weapon doesn't propel blood too far from the source. A speeding bullet, on the other hand, creates a bloody mist. And a bludgeoning wound produces large spatters that can spray far. By examining the tiny tails behind each drop of blood, Lee can determine the position of the victim and the amount of force used to create the injury. From this, and from the size of the wound, he can determine the type of weapon used and deduce the circumstances of a person's death. Lee is perhaps most famous for his work on the O.J. Simpson trial. He's also helped identify victims in mass graves in Bosnia. As soon as Lee received the photos taken from the Matheson case, he pored over them and became suspicious. He felt he was definitely looking at a crime scene.
After I received the photograph, did the detailed examination, my initial reaction, something is wrong with this case. Some foul play took place inside the van.
From the photographs of the driver's side window, Lee could tell that the blood at the front of the van was spattered at medium velocity, suggesting blunt force trauma. It appeared the victim was struck multiple times. The bloodstains on the window also contradicted Matheson's assertion that his wife dived out of it.
At the time of incident, this window was up. Approximately 200 medium velocity blood spatter was noticed in this area alone.
Lee needed to see the van firsthand to trace the trajectory of the spatter. Strings were connected to each droplet to determine their common point of origin. It turned out to be the driver's seat area, about the height where a person's head would be. Lee's findings showed the damage was inflicted before she left the vehicle. The photos from the autopsy showed that the victim's head had sustained enough damage to kill her. Once Dr. Lee determined that a struggle had occurred in the van, investigators knew that Ken Matheson was lying. His motive for killing his wife was probably money.
If she died in an accident, he would be paid $595,000, and if she died in an automobile-related accident, he would be paid $675,000.
Sir, step out of the car. Put your hands up. Keep your hands where you can see them. Face down on the ground. Come on, over here in the ground. Face down. Move it. Face down.
Based on the evidence, Ken Matheson was arrested on his day off. Police pieced together the murder. While Yvonne was driving, Ken Matheson struck her with a blunt object. She probably stopped the vehicle, or he gained control and brought it to a stop. He continued beating her to the brink of death. Marks on her hands suggested she had tried to defend herself. In the dark, Matheson probably didn't realize he was leaving the blood spatters that would be his undoing. Once he was sure that his wife wouldn't survive, he carried her out of the van and ran over her. He carried her back into the van and waited for someone to stop and call for help.
We had, a gut feeling and a lot of suspicions. We didn't have any hard evidence. So Dr. Lee's blood spatter analysis is what gave us our first piece of really hard evidence.
In 1995, Ken Matheson was sentenced to life imprisonment for kidnapping and murder. He's not eligible for parole for 25 years. Sometimes a coroner's findings can only tell part of the story. When that happens, forensic criminalists like Dr. Lee give a voice to the victims who would otherwise be silenced forever.
Victim died. She cannot testify. Physical evidence speak for her.
Matheson's simple but gruesome crime was undone by some forensic details that he just didn't count on. But can the same forensic science that proves murder also be used to prove that no murder was committed? Experts in New York State hoped it could. The town of Munnsville in central New York is one of those quiet, picturesque places that blends unnoticed into the landscape as motorists rush past. In June 1990, it became an unlikely battleground for a most unlikely soldier. The trouble started in a shabby farmhouse outside of town. Delbert Ward, 59, awoke at dawn to milk his cows. He'd tried earlier to awaken his brother, William, but he didn't move. William hadn't been feeling well lately. Delbert thought it best to let him sleep. Delbert would take care of the chores without him today. The four Ward brothers were quiet and simple-minded. They'd spent their entire lives on the dairy farm. It was their universe, all they had and all they knew. Reclusive and childlike, the brothers even shared their bed, probably as they had done since boyhood. William, the oldest, was also the smartest and strongest. He ran the show. Delbert was his right-hand man. The other brothers, Roscoe and Lyman, occasionally pitched in to help out. But on this day, June 6th, Delbert was on his own. Even after he finished his chores, he couldn't wake brother William. Something was wrong. Delbert called his brothers. The men didn't know what to do. Because the Ward brothers had no phone, Delbert and Roscoe walked to a neighbor's house to call for help. Their fourth brother, Lyman, watched after William until it arrived. 20 minutes after Delbert placed the call, state troopers and the Madison County coroner appeared at the farm. William's body was examined. No signs of foul play were noted. It seemed that 64-year-old William died peacefully in his sleep. His body was transported to the medical examiner's office, while police interviewed the surviving brothers. In the following days, the brothers tried to get on with their work. It would be difficult without Brother Bill. Delbert's life would be much harder, and his troubles were just beginning. At William's autopsy, the assistant medical examiner took tissue samples and careful notes. No indicators of natural disease were noted in the report. However, something unusual demanded attention. Pinpoint-size hemorrhages in William's eyes, mouth, and windpipe. These tiny spots, called petechial hemorrhages, can have a number of causes. Often, it's the first tip-off to death by suffocation. The assistant medical examiner couldn't rule out death by unnatural means. On the death certificate, cause of death was listed as pending further study. The district attorney was contacted and told the case was bothersome. And here's where communication apparently began to break down. The message was passed along to the state police, and the suspicions about the petechial hemorrhages became garbled along the way. Now, the possibility of homicide became a certainty. Delbert was taken to the station for questioning. He was interviewed for 4 hours.
Isn't it true that you had something to do with him being sick?
His interrogation was not recorded. According to attorney Ralph Cognetti in Albany, New York, Delbert was confused by all the attention. He only wanted to return to the farm, so he was soon willing to say anything. He signed the confession.
tell them what they want to hear and they'll let you go home. And that's in fact what they said to him. They certainly didn't let him go home after he confessed. But if you have an opportunity to read the confession, it really sounds like a Harvard dissertation. And you know, certainly inside, that did not come from Delbert's lips.
Nevertheless, the confession, coupled with the autopsy results, were enough to arrest Delbert. Later, a grand jury handed up an indictment against him for second-degree murder. To the people of Munnsville, population 400, it was absurd to think that Delbert would or could have killed his brother. They believed the state had it all wrong. When his bail was set at $10,000, the whole town chipped in and raised the money in a matter of hours. The kindness of the neighbors and the plight of Delbert Ward earned an article in the New York Times. The groundswell of support for Delbert began to grow. A friend of the Wards brought Ralph Cognetti into the case. Based on his conversation with Delbert, Cognetti was convinced of his client's innocence. A review of the evidence suggested that the homicide charge was based more on Delbert's confession than on the physical evidence from the medical examiner's office. As Cognetti was putting his defense together, he received a fateful call. The man identified himself as Cyril Wecht. The name meant nothing to Cognetti.
Here was a gentleman who explained that he was a forensic pathologist from Pittsburgh, and that he had read the article, read the story about the boys, and was willing to review whatever evidence we had without any cost to us.
In other words, what you're telling me is...
Dr. Cyril Wecht's reputation spreads far beyond the walls of the coroner's office in Pittsburgh, where he works as the chief forensic pathologist for Allegheny County. He's helped investigators on the assassination of Robert Kennedy and has consulted in the death of Elvis Presley. Besides degrees in medicine, Wecht also holds a degree in law. He'd read about the Delbert Ward case in the New York Times, and it piqued his interest. He requested William Ward's case file.
After I reviewed the case file, which included the autopsy report, my initial impression was that there was an inadequate basis for any forensic pathologist to conclude that this was an asphyxiation death from suffocation, smothering. There simply were not adequate findings for such a diagnosis.
Using the assistant medical examiner's original notes, Wecht formulated a more mundane diagnosis. William Ward died of heart disease, the #1 killer of men his age in America. The Ward brothers had in fact told authorities that William had been in poor health for years, but he refused to see a physician. His symptoms were consistent with cardiovascular disease, supporting Wecht's theory. But the prosecution believed that William's illness may have provided a motive for his murder. Did Delbert Ward kill his brother William? The state of New York said he did. According to their theory, Delbert suffocated his brother to release him from his failing health. They said that it may have been a mercy killing, but it was murder nonetheless. The prosecution pointed to Delbert's odd behavior on the day of William's death. When Delbert couldn't rouse his brother at the crack of dawn like he normally did, he went about his chores anyhow. To the prosecution, that lack of concern suggested guilt. To Ralph Cognetti, it said more about the realities of life on a farm.
It was a point that the prosecutor jumped on. How could a person who was so concerned about his brother's well-being go and milk cows? What came out at trial, and what I'm sure the jurors knew because we had 1 or 2 dairy farmers on the jury, was that if you don't milk a cow when it needs to be milked, then that cow's going to get very ill
Cognetti and Cyril Wecht stuck with the idea that William died of natural causes, but they had to prove it. The victim had already been buried. All Wecht had to work from were the autopsy records, those same records and tissue samples that the state claimed showed nothing unusual besides the petechial hemorrhages. That's not how Wecht read them. He was confident that he had everything he needed to prove Ward's innocence. According to the thin tissue samples gathered at William Ward's autopsy, along with the medical examiner's data, William's heart was enlarged and his coronary arteries suffered a blockage of 20%. His right lung was heavily scarred and weighed twice as much as his left. His liver and spleen also were enlarged. Without a drastic change in habits, death by heart disease seemed inevitable for William. But Wecht had to undermine the prosecution's assertion that he was murdered to be relieved of his suffering. Though Wecht had only photographs and tissue samples of William Ward to work from, he called upon his vast experience on other cases where he had examined the bodies directly. He noted the petechiae, the telltale red hemorrhages found in the victim's eyes and mouth. To the state, these were clear signs of strangling. They eclipsed all other symptoms. While it's true that petechial hemorrhages can indicate smothering, they're not enough to prove it beyond a doubt. Unless a person is somehow incapacitated before he's smothered, the body will likely show signs of a struggle. William Ward's did not.
No injuries around the mouth, in the mouth and the tongue, the gums. No injuries on or around the neck. No evidence of increased fluidity of the blood. No evidence of increased blueness of the blood. No aspiration of gastric contents that will occur as a person struggles. So we had none of it.
For the defense, there was no evidence of murder. William simply died in his sleep of heart disease. The homicide charge was the result of an unfortunate series of miscommunications that had grown out of control.
Or you can take the incident seen by one person and then passed on to a second and to a third. And then when you get down to the 6th or the 10th or the 15th, you'll find that that story bears very little relationship to the original creation, to the original version.
Coming into the case as an outsider, Wecht was immune to the preconceptions that Delbert Ward was a murderer. By looking at the case with a fresh perspective, he won Delbert's freedom. On April 5th, 1991, Delbert Ward was acquitted of all charges.
It grew like a bomb almost. It started small, and then by the end of the trial, he became what he is today, really a legend, certainly in that part of the state.
Cyril Wecht believes that the situation that Delbert Ward found himself in was not unusual. He's seen many cases that were tainted by a medical examiner's wrong assumptions, an investigator's speedy conclusion, or a simple misunderstanding. Unfortunately, these errors tend to compound themselves.
We work closely and constantly with homicide detectives, with police, with district attorneys. We hear their versions. Consciously, subconsciously, those versions begin to take hold. And the mind then begins to work. And you build up then your own impressions, ultimately your own opinions and conclusions that fit in best with those.
No matter how mysterious or suspicious a death may appear, the truth can be resurrected in the lab. Every day, the forensic skills of the medical examiner, coroner, and crime scene expert prove that the most important witness to a death is the deceased.
Tonight, I go back home to Georgia to look into the death of a young wife.
That Atlanta wife murdered as she opened her very own front door. An all-new 2020 starts right now.
This is a true murder mystery. Emphasis on murder, emphasis on mystery.
I felt like Lita's murder case looks like a true crime story, but it goes a lot deeper.
Who would kill this woman? She wasn't robbed. Somebody came to the door with roses and shot her dead.
Was there a feeling that this had to be pretty calculated?
She was shot with a 9mm semi-automatic handgun.
No obvious suspect.
Was she at all concerned about the fact that she was in an interracial marriage and that this was a difficult time in the South?
It was not a welcoming place for a black woman to live.
She said, I'm done. I'm packing up my stuff.
I want you to see the puzzle. When I put it together and I show it to you, you'll never forget it.
Your wife's best friend has been murdered, and police are looking at you. It's a chilly, drizzly winter Atlanta morning, and 35-year-old Lita McClinton is suddenly awakened.
It's around 8:15 in the morning, and she heard the doorbell ring. And she tightens up her rope and goes downstairs to open the door.
And I think she was probably not going to open it, but she looked through the keyhole and saw that the person had a box of flowers.
There was a man standing at the door holding a long white box of long stem roses that had a big, thick pink ribbon around it.
So she receives the flowers, thinking that this is a delivery.
She was really excited. She thought that it was a gift from one of her friends.
In a sea of red brick townhouses, Lita's white one stands out. Her best friend Poppy and 3-year-old daughter have spent the night, and they are still in bed upstairs, just waking up.
Poppy hears her say, "Good morning," to the man at the door.
The flower delivery man produces a handgun. He fires a shot.
She actually put the box of roses in front of her face. The second shot went right through the center of her head, and she fell with a large thud.
Lita's friend Poppy was upstairs with her toddler. And right away, she grabbed her daughter and hid her into a closet and said, "You gotta be quiet, quiet as a mouse." She didn't know if the gunman was gonna come for her. Lita's neighbor hears the shots, then sees the guy running like a bat out of hell, just booking it out of the complex, and he calls 911.
The first police officer is only a few blocks away, and he gets the call, and so that police officer ends up holding Lita's hand. They thought Lita was completely unconscious, and yet she managed to squeeze his hand as he kept comforting her and telling her everything was going to be okay. And he said it was her comforting him. Poppy got out of the closet and called Lita's mother, and she couldn't get words out, and she finally just said, "Lita's been shot." Lita's mother called her husband. When they went to the hospital, they were put in a separate little waiting room. The doctor tended to Lita. He came out about 30 minutes later and said, "I'm sorry."
Never get easier because she's gone. We should have gone first, not her.
Atlanta's exclusive Buckhead neighborhood is known for its sprawling mansions, not murder. So when the shooting happened right here, neighbors were shocked and on edge.
Sullivan was found in the doorway of her townhouse, shot twice in the head.
It's pretty surprising that in this area, those kinds of things probably wouldn't happen.
How did you learn that Lita had been killed?
I ran to the TV because I heard Sullivan
on Slayton Drive.
Police say a box of roses was found near her body. The gunman apparently posed as a delivery man.
And I said, oh my God, that's Lita.
Detectives on the scene found a bullet fragment, 2 shell casings, and the box of roses.
2 gunshots from a 9mm penetrated the box. The weapon was never found. To this day, it's never been found.
In this case, you had just a minor amount of evidence.
At the time, it was the top story on the news, and law enforcement officers felt a great deal of pressure in order to bring Lita's killer to justice.
For years, Lita's case was cold, buried underneath the weight of unanswered questions and fading memories.
I'm Deb Miller Landau, and I just wrote a book called A Devil Went Down to Georgia about the murder of Lita McClinton Sullivan. I covered the story for Atlanta Magazine back in 2004, and the more people I talked to, the more that I researched, the more I felt like I began to know Lita. So talking about the day that she died feels personal.
The case was also personal to Clint Rucker, the prosecutor. When I came to Atlanta to meet up with him, I learned that one of his passions is puzzles, working from the outside in, which also translates to solving homicides. Where do you begin? How do you start to connect?
When I'm putting together a puzzle, not only in real life, but also a murder case, I make an assessment about what it is I'm working with. I start to identify pieces of the puzzle that are foundational.
Lita's murder case looks like a true crime story, but it goes a lot deeper. It's a story about love and loss and greed.
Lita had been reared in Atlanta's Black Elite.
You know, on the surface, she was living an Atlanta dream.
A prosperous upbringing.
A very prosperous upbringing. The expectations for her life were pretty high.
Black women have had to be exceptional in order to be seen. And that was the case then, and I think it's still the case now.
One thing seems certain, a murder of this kind is personal.
Was there a feeling that this had to be pretty calculated?
Police knew almost immediately Lita Sullivan was the intended victim.
Who would kill this woman? She wasn't robbed. Somebody came to the door with roses and shot her dead.
Atlanta had its fair share of crime, but this was most certainly one of the highest profile cases that got reported in the news.
Sullivan was shot twice in the head. A box of roses found next to her body.
Using a flower delivery man and shooting her, it was something that just kind of stuck out to me.
Atlanta, Georgia, billed as a vibrant melting pot, a destination for creatives. But if you grew up in Georgia in the 1970s, as I did, you know this was a very different place then. One still emerging from the dark shadows of segregation and racial tensions. What was 1970s Atlanta like when she was sort of coming along?
We've got African Americans that are kind of ascending into really prominent positions. Lita also is ascending because her parents are a part of this movement.
Lita's parents, Emory and Joanne McClinton, were both power players, movers and shakers in Atlanta.
Emory McClinton was on the State Board of Transportation. Joanne McClinton was a member of the Georgia legislature.
Joanne will tell you stories about being in really interpersonal meetings with Dr. King.
She was Maynard Jackson's campaign manager when he ran for mayor.
I think the McClintons had high expectations for who Lita would become. Lita Sullivan was a true daughter of Atlanta.
She was just a gem, very, very proper.
And she had grown up in a world of cotillions, so she really was sort of that classic upper crust black person growing up in Atlanta.
She knew where she was going.
She had a great sense of style.
And absolutely charming.
After high school, she went on to Spelman College. Her parents sort of hoped that she would enter the political arena like they were, but she was very much into fashion. She was working at a boutique at Lenox Square, and in walks this guy who had unruly curls and weird glasses and just immediately saw Lita and was taken with her.
Fresh out of college, 24-year-old Lita is smitten with James, Jim Sullivan. He's a bit older, 35, and he's also white.
He showered her with gifts. He just completely showered her with attention.
He comes in, he dazzles her. What did you learn about him?
I learned that what he saw was a fantasy in Lita. I think he looked at her as a young, very attractive, very smart African-American female.
Another big difference between them is class. Lita has been raised in Atlanta's high society and Jim on Boston's gritty South Side.
He grew up in a very middle to lower middle class environment.
He went to Holy Cross College, got a bachelor's degree in economics.
He always wanted more for himself. He always wanted to be a rich person, but it didn't seem like that was in the cards. He was an accountant. He was working hard, but he really wasn't getting ahead.
But life is about to change for Jim Sullivan when he inherits a thriving liquor distributorship from his uncle, worth millions of dollars.
Crown Beverages was worth around $3.2 million. Jim had become a wealthy man. So when the McClintons met Jim for the first time, they were like, who is this guy? He had this kind of manner that was very uncouth and brash, and they were sort of mystified about what their daughter saw in him. I mean, I think the only thing they had in common was that he was Catholic and they were Catholic as well. But everything else was complete polar opposites.
Another concern, of course, was race. Remember, this is the 70s. Even though the country is watching color barriers slipping away on the hit show The Jeffersons, with Primetime's first interracial couple.
Your parents have never gotten over the fact that I'm white.
That's because you never got over being white.
At that time, this was unusual.
Georgia's anti-miscegenation laws that forbade blacks and whites to marry had only been repealed 10 years earlier.
Still, despite their obvious differences, Jim Sullivan pops the question to Lita.
So the McClintons were like, you cannot marry this man.
They felt like Lita was really making a mistake and was kind of caught up in the exuberance of this relationship.
Despite her parents' strong objections, Lita and Jim are engaged. But on the eve of her wedding, Jim drops a bomb.
He tells Lita that he has been married before and that he has 4 children. Lita was shocked.
And then, the very same night, Jim Sullivan blindsides his bride-to-be again.
He whips out a piece of paper and he says, can you sign this? And then she looks down and sees that he's drawn up a prenuptial agreement. And she's like, what is this?
Apparently determined to protect his newfound wealth, Sullivan surprises Lita with a prenup, which says that in the event of a divorce, she would walk away with virtually nothing. She's reluctant, but the cake is ordered, the flowers are ready, so Lita signs the agreement and ties the knot anyway.
Lita got married in 1976. It was a small ceremony in Macon, Georgia. Joanne McClinton would later describe that as the worst day of her life.
The newlyweds settle some 80 miles south of Atlanta near Jim's business in Macon. It's a world away from Atlanta. But Lita agrees to give up her current job and her income and become full-time Mrs. Jim Sullivan.
They bought a house in Shirley Hills, a very affluent, very white part of Macon. Joanne and Emery McClinton feared for their daughter. Being part of an interracial couple in Macon, Georgia in the 1970s would have been extraordinarily challenging. The neighbors were like, you have the gall to bring a black wife to Shirley Hills. People threw garbage on their doorstep.
The out-and-out racism had to be tough for Lita. But she moves forward and makes some new connections and friends, including Yvette Miller.
When Lita and Yvette occasionally go out to eat, she notices something a bit curious.
We'd go out to lunch at a nice restaurant, and she couldn't pay the bill. And I would end up picking up the check.
And they were a wealthy couple.
They were very wealthy.
Then one Christmas season, a card arrives in the mail addressed to Jim. Lita opens it, and what she discovers will make her question everything. Lita and Jim Sullivan's first few months of marriage seemed to be going well.
They were both intelligent, both attractive, definitely upper class, high society.
But just beneath the surface, there's some obvious cracks.
They seemed to be loving at first.
At first?
He was not that nice to her, and he was not that kind to her.
Was he brusque? Was he brash?
He was a bit arrogant. Even though he had all of these resources, he did not, in my opinion, take care of his wife.
Friends say that the once generous millionaire has suddenly become a miser.
He was notoriously cheap.
He would wear his dead uncle's clothes around the house. He would use the sheath from the dry cleaning as saran wrap in the kitchen. He didn't want Lita to work, but he kept her on a very tight allowance where he gave her $150 a week.
Did she express any discontentment with her marriage?
When we were at those restaurants, Jim just does not give me enough money to take care of me and the house. You know, she clearly was not happy.
Was there talk of infidelity?
Lita had several instances where she questioned whether or not her husband was actually having an affair.
One day she finds a long blonde hair in their master bathroom, and she asks Jim about it, and he says, I don't know what you're talking about. They got into this cycle of, she accused him of philandering. He would deny it, and then he would buy her sort of an expensive jewelry apology.
Then, during the holidays one year, Lita makes another stunning discovery.
A Christmas card came addressed to Jim. She opened it. A woman wrote in something like, missing your kisses. The woman's return address was on the envelope, so Lita went and spoke to her, and the woman said that she had been having an affair with Jim.
Lita is distraught and goes home to be with her parents in Atlanta. But her husband manages to lure her back, increasing her weekly allowance in a now post-nuptial agreement.
Now it's $300 instead of $150 a week, but it still shows that all of their assets belong to Jim.
That's right, the successful business, Lita's Mercedes, multiple properties, even her jewelry, still belong to her husband in the event of a divorce.
But in an attempt at reconciliation, Lita signs the postnup.
Just a few months after Lita signs that agreement, without Lita knowing, Sullivan decides to sell Crown Beverages for $5 million.
And that's not all. He tells her they're moving to Palm Beach, Florida.
Lita was in shock.
She had any clue that he was going to whistle her down to Palm Beach.
But Lita's new Florida home, located a stone's throw from what would become Mar-a-Lago, is more elaborate than she ever would have imagined. Called Casa Alita, It's a 17,000 square foot mansion with 8 oceanfront bedrooms.
It was just unbelievable.
When you went to Jim's home, you go through this tunnel and you would be at the beach. It's your own private beach.
But for Lita, everything that glitters isn't exactly gold.
James Sullivan very much wanted to integrate himself into the upper echelons of society, and his aspirations did not include Lita's participation.
It was not a welcoming place for a black woman to live. And when he found out that to sort of scale the level of social plateau he was looking at in Palm Beach, having a black wife was a serious impediment to that.
She was left out of some affairs, and she really became upset.
So even though they had money, this is a moneyed crowd, didn't really matter though.
He was barely rich compared to Palm Beach.
Did he want to be in that crowd?
Oh yes, he wanted to, be accepted as one of the rich and famous.
It doesn't take long before Jim starts to flirt with other women.
And it's at a cocktail party that one particularly elegant Palm Beach woman catches Sullivan's eye.
Jim sees Suki Rogers, who is a Korean-born socialite.
She was telegenic. She had a spicy personality. I think a man like Jim Sullivan could not help but be intrigued by this beautiful woman.
They started dating. He's still married to Lita.
By now, the Sullivans have been married nearly 10 years, but things are about to explode.
Lita finds women's lingerie in their master bed. It's the bra that broke the camel's back.
She said, I'm done. I'm packing up my stuff and I'm going back home.
Lita arrives back in Atlanta. The very next day, she files for divorce from Jim.
But Sullivan fights Lita every step of the way, and the divorce drags on.
Did she seem concerned, worried, nervous about her breakup?
What I detected was she was excited, and she was cutting the cord and leaving Jim alone. She wanted her life back.
While Lita is looking forward to a new life of freedom, she can't be happy about the prospect of leaving her marriage with virtually nothing. No career, no Palm Beach mansion, no Buckhead townhouse, and $2,500 a month in alimony for 3 years. So Lita is going to divorce court, determined to fight for what she believes she deserves.
All she wanted was a reasonable financial settlement so that she could kind of go on with her life.
January 16th, 1987 was set up to be a pivotal day in the lives of Lita and Jim Sullivan.
A judge was going to decide whether or not to throw out the postnuptial agreement.
She might get as much as close to $1 million in cash and assets.
The morning of January 16th, Lita Sullivan, she'd lose her life that day in a murder.
With Lita out of the picture, Jim Sullivan stands to gain the property that they had and retain control over all his money.
Sullivan was the main suspect.
That is, until a treasure trove of secret recordings of Lita's private conversations are uncovered, taking this investigation in a whole new direction. And police are looking at you.
You make a big circle and you put everybody in it that's close to Lita. Everybody's a suspect. But the first one would be the husband.
The first and obvious suspect was James Sullivan, who stood to gain everything from her death, all the property, all the monies, and who was contesting the divorce.
Detectives went down to speak to him in Palm Beach, and they put him through a polygraph.
Jim Sullivan not only passes the polygraph, but there's something else. He has an alibi that puts him nearly 700 miles away from the crime scene.
James Sullivan was actually in Palm Beach at the time of Lita's murder.
When you first look at it, it looks pretty cut and dry. When you interview all the people involved, everybody points in one direction, towards the husband. But when you sit down and look at the facts, I'm not so sure that the husband is the person that committed the crime.
Nothing surfaced in the early stages of the investigation that implicated Jim Sullivan in the murder.
Sullivan is cooperating with authorities, and during his interview with detectives, he mentions the name of his friend, Marvin Marable.
At the time of Lita's death, Marvin and James Sullivan had a very close relationship.
Remember, Marvin Marable is married to Lita's best friend, Poppy, who was in the Buckhead townhouse with her 3-year-old daughter the morning that Lita was murdered. But back before the shooting, the friendship hadn't always sat well with Marvin.
When Lita moved back to Atlanta, they started, hanging out together.
So she's disillusioned by her relationship. Did her failed relationship have any impact on your relationship?
Well, from the standpoint of them, being together all the time and going out, yeah.
Commiserating.
Oh, absolutely. Certainly didn't help. I can understand her being there for her friend, but, sometimes you can go overboard, which is what happened in our relationship.
Marable, a former New York State trooper turned entrepreneur, says Lita would often spend hours at his home with Poppy. And it was during this time, he says, coincidentally or not, that his own marriage began to unravel.
I found a letter where Poppy was planning to file for divorce.
So she was planning to file for divorce without your knowledge?
Oh, yeah.
That had to be a shocker.
It was.
So then you decided to try something a little questionable after that.
I have a background in law enforcement. I don't see it as questionable. It's your own telephone in your own house. I put a recorder on the, people call it a tap, on the phone, and I started recording conversations.
In the house phone?
Mm-hmm. On the house phone.
He began listening to Poppy and Lita's conversations and ended up recording more than 300 hours.
And during those very personal conversations between girlfriends, Marvin Marable learns that there may be some information that James Sullivan might be interested in learning that will be helpful for him in his divorce case.
He tells Sullivan about the tapes and what's on them, specifically Lita's post-divorce plans.
And soon enough, the two disgruntled husbands are conspiring to get the best of their soon-to-be ex-wives in divorce court.
Marvin Marable travels down to Palm Beach under a false name, and the two men listen to the tapes, and Marvin says, "I'm not going to record anymore," and Jim says, no, keep recording.
Was there talk of money?
Yeah, he offered $30,000.
Jim says to Marvin, if the judge decides to honor the postnuptial agreement, he's going to give Marvin $30,000 for the use of the information on the tapes.
What kinds of things did Lita talk about that could be helpful to either one of you?
There were some guys that, she would talk to, but she was legally separated.
But then, just a few days after Marvin and Jim's secret meeting at Casa Elita,
Poppy and Lita somehow discovered the recording device.
How did they react?
It wasn't nice. She filed for divorce the next day.
She was angry.
She was very angry.
Lita was upset too, so upset that she reported Marvin to the authorities, and he was charged with possession of an eavesdropping device. So when police questioned Sullivan about who might have a motive to murder his wife, he tells them to look no further than Marvin Marable.
And sure enough, only a few days after Lita's death, Marvin is being questioned by the Atlanta Police Department about Lita's murder.
I go down for the interview, and the first thing they did is read me my rights. And from there on, it was just a nightmare. I was a prime suspect.
You have a law enforcement background, so you knew what police
So I knew that I was being followed. I could pick the investigators, police, could pick them out all the time. Jim had mentioned my name to them. He said, look at Marvin Marable.
This was serious stuff.
Oh, yeah.
How worried were you?
I was very worried.
Joanne and Emery McClinton were beyond devastated. Their eldest daughter was dead. Just 3 days after Lita's murder, they held a funeral.
Days dissolve into months, and authorities are no closer to finding Lita Sullivan's murderer.
The case is just sort of growing colder and colder by the minute.
And while Marvin Marable might have been angry at Lita for pressing those charges against him for eavesdropping, there was no evidence he was responsible for her death.
I know that people get wrongly accused, wrongly convicted, and so the only saving grace is the fact that I knew I was innocent.
By process of elimination is you can determine the pieces that don't fit.
And just eliminate them.
The way in which we eliminated Marvin Marable as a suspect. There was just not enough to connect him directly to the crime itself.
As for that eavesdropping device charge, Marvin was put on probation, which he completed, and then he was exonerated. But on those recordings Marable made, Lita had talked about other men, something that her soon-to-be ex-husband Sullivan pointed out to police.
He made allegations that she was participating in extramarital affairs, and that perhaps this was the action of, you know, a disgruntled boyfriend.
We have a lot of major players. At this point in the investigation, we have a lot of suspects.
One of the first men police question is a professional athlete.
Lita and him had been friends when she was in Palm Beach. The police quickly found out that he was in prison for drug possession.
That athlete is behind bars when Lita is killed, so clearly he can't be the trigger man. Then investigators turn their sights to a prominent Atlanta businessman.
And he and Lita had been childhood friends, and they sort of rekindled their friendship. And they realized that he had no motive, and they found nothing that connected him.
Authorities also take a hard look at another suitor who had taken Lita to dinner the night before her death, and get this, had also given her 2 roses.
The suspect was a man named Bob Daniel, and Bob had had an incident a couple months before the murder where, in a drunken rage, he came to Lita's house, smashed his car into the garage, and as the cops were taking him away, he said, "I'm gonna kill that." So, serious red flag.
But that lead didn't go anywhere either.
Bob had just had quadruple bypass surgery. You know, the police ultimately decided that Bob had nothing to do with it.
It's the unknowing that makes it so difficult. And to know that there are individuals who may be walking around now planning and plotting to do the same thing to somebody else is abhorrent to me.
I remember having the impression it was like a festering wound for them.
The McClintons want to draw attention to a $25,000 reward in the case.
The cause of finding justice for Lita became their obsession, became their passion.
The reward is for the arrest and conviction of those individuals responsible for our daughter's murder.
To catch Lita's killer, the Atlanta Police Department assigns 2 veteran detectives to the case.
If Lieutenant Walker bears a resemblance to actor Billy D. Williams, Welcome Harris reminds one of Columbo, the dogged, disheveled detective of television fame.
Building a murder case was like making a mosaic. You know, you get a shiny piece of glass here, a gem there. You put it together and you hope that from it emerges the shimmering image of a killer.
This particular case deals with what I consider to be high society. It contains a little bit of everything. Intrigue, mystery,
These days, a lot of murders are solved using DNA technology, ring camera technology. But back then, it was detective work.
She was shot with a 9mm semi-automatic handgun.
Most important thing found at the crime scene was the roses.
They canvassed all the area flower shops and quickly found that the roses had been purchased at the Botany Bay flower shop.
They interviewed the worker in there, and he told them that this guy came in about 8 o'clock and bought these roses and paid in cash and then left. And he was in a small car.
The florist gave a description of the man buying the flowers and another man who was waiting in the car.
So detectives know they're looking for at least 2 men.
Until yet another person is described to police. That flower delivery man who had looked Lita's neighbor right in the eye.
There was a next-door neighbor of Lita's, lived over on the right side of her condo. He lived there. His name was Bob Christensen.
He actually gave a description of the flower delivery man as a Caucasian, middle-aged man.
They went down to the police station and worked with a police artist and got sketches. As the sketches were being completed, the officers were realizing, obviously, that the shooter was not Jim Sullivan and that the other individuals were all 3 distinct individuals. They didn't look anything like each other, so therefore we knew 3 people were involved.
For investigators, this has all the earmarks of only one thing: murder for hire.
All the evidence pointed to a hitman showing up at the front door, posing as a flower delivery man, and firing a gunshot into Lita's head.
With investigators now exploring the possibility that Lita was murdered by a hired gunman, another critical piece of evidence comes to light: a mysterious phone call.
And what they found was that on the same day that Lita was murdered, about an hour after the actual shooting, there was a collect phone call that was placed from a payphone right outside of Atlanta, Georgia.
Was this a call from the killer?
I don't know about you. I haven't had a collect call from a payphone. So as a cop, you probably go, I wonder if that's connected.
And a tip from a woman 700 miles away may just be the big break investigators have been waiting for.
I said, anyone knows that if you wanted to get a woman to answer the door, all you would have to do is take flowers to the door.
This was a huge puzzle of a case.
A hitman showing up at the front door, posing as a flower delivery man, firing a gunshot into Lita's head.
How did your puzzle-solving skills come into play?
You figure out what fits and what doesn't fit.
I want everyone listening to this to know that I am absolutely innocent.
The loss of a daughter.
They still don't have the murder weapon.
But they do have witnesses.
Do you know anybody who can possibly take care of my problem for me? Because I need some help here.
Anyone knows that if you wanted to get a woman to answer the door, all you would have to do is take flowers to the door.
She suggested the flowers.
She suggested the flowers.
You actually brought in a doorbell. Why?
To have that sense of what Lita Sullivan experienced right before her murder. She's about to meet her maker.
It's a deadly delivery of a dozen pink roses. 35-year-old Lita McClinton Sullivan opens her front door and is suddenly gunned down.
On the year anniversary of Lita's death, there are no named suspects. They still don't have the murder weapon. They don't have a hitman. They don't have a paper trail that ties Jim or anyone else to a hit.
But that's about to change when they get Jim Sullivan's phone records.
On the same day that Lita was murdered, about an hour or so after the actual shooting, there was a collect phone call to James Sullivan's home in Palm Beach, Florida.
It turns out to be from a rest stop in Suwanee, Georgia, maybe 30 or 40 miles from Buckhead. Using a phone call to call another state, that opens up federal jurisdiction. In this case, that's the FBI.
We believed the phone call from Suwanee rest stop to his home in Palm Beach, Florida, was sufficient indication that a contract hitter may have called him after doing the job.
Enter Special Agent John Kingston, who takes a particular interest in that phone call and a whole slew of other calls Jim Sullivan made and received around the time of Lita's murder.
I got a whole year's worth, 6 months before the murder to 6 months after the murder.
Kingston notices a few calls, and one of them was to Bob Christensen, Lita's neighbor. When Kingston talks to Bob, he finds out that Jim had called Bob 3 days before the murder.
Sullivan said, had he seen anything suspicious around Lita's townhouse?
And Bob finds it strange. He hasn't talked to Jim in over a year.
Bob Christensen shares something else with Agent Kingston. On the same day Jim Sullivan called him, 3 days before the fatal flower delivery, Lita heard a loud knock on her door at 5 or 6 in the morning. It was so early and so unnerving, she didn't answer it.
So that made the call that he got from Jim even more suspicious.
Kingston also finds that a call is made between Jim's house and a Howard Johnson's motel in Atlanta, just a couple of miles from Lita's house. This is really strange. One thing that he's learned about Jim is that he's not a Hojo's kind of guy. So he goes to the Howard Johnsons and asks if he can look through the records.
They gave me the shoebox with all the registration cards, and I pick out 3 that I thought, well, these are awfully interesting. So I said, do you guys have the phone records? They said, yeah, sure we do. And I'm thinking, boy, these people keep really good records, and they keep them for a long time, and I'm really glad. They bring me the phone records for January 13th. I'm flipping through them, and all of a sudden I see 305 Palm Beach, South Florida area code. And I'm pretty sure it's Jim's number. And so I check my records real quick, and I go, yep, that's his number. And then I look, and I said, oh, look, it's from 518. That's one of the 3 cards I pulled out. Well, it just so happens I have a copy of it here. And one of the things it imparts is 3 individuals checked into the room. The individual who actually registered used the name Johnny Furr, but 3 individuals is important to me because I think 3 people involved in the crime. They put their car down as a Toyota 85 with a North Carolina plate. We believe that a Toyota was the getaway car for the murder. So there's 2 coincidences already.
But remember, these motel records are from January 13th. Lita was murdered 3 days later on the 16th. Special Agent Kingston is beginning to surmise that the killers may have tried and failed to get to her once before.
What I believe it to be is the killers having come down 3 days before the actual murder was committed, knocking on her door, her not answering it, and them having to stop and regroup and figure out what plan B is going to be. So I am in love with this registration card and becomes the focal point of my life for the next several months.
Kingston's next move is to locate this so-called Johnny Furr with the North Carolina license plate.
And to my surprise, there are 150 John or Johnny Furrs in North Carolina. But to my great surprise, 115 of these 150 are in a very small circle in North Carolina between the 3 cities of Albemarle, Concord, and Kannapolis.
They're going to knock on every door and find this Johnny Furr. Of course, they're coming from Georgia, and anytime the FBI goes and investigates in another state, they need that state's approval. And just as they're about to get to the state border, their boss calls them and says, North Carolina's denying you entry, and they'll take it from here.
And that pretty much kills my case. that kills my case.
Yeah, soon after that, Agent Kingston is transferred to another job, and that whole investigation just sort of fades away. Meantime, in Palm Beach, Jim and Suki are living the high life. So with Lita out of the picture, Jim is free to marry Suki, which he does 8 months after Lita's murder.
He's thinking that he's the cat's meow. Eating in restaurants in Palm Beach, going to parties, got another attractive woman on his arm.
Jim drives around town in a Rolls Royce and gets into a fender bender and has to go to traffic court. Jim says to the judge, well, you've misunderstood. I wasn't even driving that day. Suki was driving. So the judge says, we're going to throw it out. However, the cop who was on the scene catches wind and he says Suki wasn't even in the car that day. It was Jim driving alone. So now Jim has perjured himself, as has Suki.
Jim ultimately got convicted of perjury, was given a year probation and a year of home confinement.
Suki Sullivan also receives a year of probation.
Suki's freaking out. When she gets charged with perjury on his behalf, she's like, I'm done with this. Suki files for divorce from Jim. And the trial that follows is the juiciest, craziest gossip in town. So when it's Suki's turn to testify, she drops a bomb.
Did he talk to you about his former wife, Lita?
Yes.
Tell me what it was he said to you about Lita.
You can hear a pin drop. It's a big moment. After 33 months of marriage, Suki files for divorce from Jim.
Not surprisingly, it's another disputed divorce. But what might have been typical testimony about alimony takes a sudden turn in court.
Tell me what it was he said to you about Lita.
He hired someone to rid of her.
I'm sorry?
He hired someone to rid of her.
She claimed that he confessed to her that he had Lita killed.
This became a bombshell in the investigation of the murder of Lita Sullivan.
Suki Sullivan's divorce testimony may be big news for the FBI, but it has zero impact on the divorce judgment, which favors her husband, Jim Sullivan, in nearly every way.
His divorce was complete, but his life with turmoil was just beginning.
The opulent ocean-facing Palm Beach Palace may look like something out of The Great Gatsby, but while we watched, a new chapter in a crime story was unfolding.
We develop information here at WSB. There's going to be a raid on Jim Sullivan's Palm Beach mansion, and that is the biggest break in the Lita Sullivan case since the murder itself.
Investigators from the FBI, Atlanta Police, and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation were on the grounds of a mansion identified as that of James Sullivan.
All of a sudden, Jim Sullivan is clearly in the crosshairs of federal authorities.
They got a tip that Jim, now a convicted felon, has guns in the house. Of course, you're not allowed to have guns if you're a convicted felon. So they put together a sweeping affidavit to get a search warrant.
We did see a number of guns loaded into a car and this box carried out.
When they found the guns, he was in violation of his probation, and so he went to jail for 9 months.
All this time, a federal grand jury has been convening in Atlanta.
They've got what they found in the mansion. They got what they found in the phone records. They've got Suki Sullivan. They've got the neighbors. What they don't have are the identities of the hit team. There's a problem, though.
We, the federal government, have a 5-year statute of limitations, which is going to be up on January 16th of '92.
With 5 or 6 days to go before it expired, the U.S. Attorney made a bold decision. We're going to take our best shot with what we got right now, so they indict Jim Sullivan.
Jim Sullivan is indicted on multiple counts of arranging Lita's murder for hire through interstate phone calls.
Millionaire James V. Sullivan is on trial in connection with an alleged murder for hire plot. Here he arrives for the first day of trial testimony.
It was a trial that transfixed Atlanta. I mean, it was something we were covering on basically a daily basis. But we couldn't have it on camera because it's federal court.
It looks like the family is finally going to have some accountability for the murder of their daughter, Lita.
The prosecution suggests the killers were calling Sullivan from the rest stop to say the job was done. The defense suggests otherwise.
Jim Sullivan is lawyered up with the best criminal defense lawyers that you can find anywhere in Atlanta and maybe in the whole country.
There is no evidence at this point in this case who placed that call or whether that call was placed by anyone connected with the crime.
The prosecutor spent 2 weeks telling their side of the story.
Suki, the woman he married months after Lita's death, delivered some of the most dramatic testimony the jury has heard.
They build what they feel like is a really strong case.
And then a big bombshell hits.
The judge says, I'm forced to dismiss this case for lack of evidence.
Judge Marvin Shube ruled that, in effect, even if Sullivan may have been involved in the murder for hire, the government fell short in proving the phone calls related to the murder.
This is one of the most difficult decisions I had to make because I firmly believe in the jury system.
And then he looks at Jim and he says, you've been acquitted.
This was ultra shocking.
Suddenly it's over, and Jim is a free man.
I want everyone listening to this to know that I am absolutely innocent. I had nothing to do with Lita's death. Her death was a great tragedy, and I thank God and my attorneys that this ordeal is over.
The family at that point, I guess, is just sort of at a loss. How devastating was that for them?
They felt like the justice system had let them down.
I was not expecting this. It's extremely difficult.
The system today is weighed in the favor of the defense.
James Sullivan seems to have gotten away with murder.
But Lita's parents aren't giving up.
They file a wrongful death suit in Palm Beach, Florida, and they win.
We, the jury, return the following verdict.
The jury deems that Jim is guilty of wrongful death.
Total damages of the estate of Lita McClinton Sullivan, $4 million.
But Sullivan is able to hide his assets and not pay any of the civil judgment.
Jim Sullivan appealed their civil judgment, and he won by having the Florida court say that they had filed it after the Florida statute of limitations.
Once again, Jim has wiggled out of any responsibility, and the family is left dumbfounded.
Until
a call is received out of the blue.
A young woman comes forward. It proved to be the break in the case that everyone was looking for.
"11 years have gone by since Lita Sullivan was gunned down on her doorstep when a tip comes in from a town 700 miles away.
A call is received out of the blue, and the individual calling is an attorney in Beaumont, Texas. He has a receptionist whose name is Belinda Trahan, who has told him a very unusual story about her boyfriend, Tony Harwood.
Belinda and Tony lived together in Albemarle, North Carolina, and he was a long-distance truck driver for North American Van Lines.
He basically drove a moving truck.
Belinda tells her boss about a time that Tony came home from a long-haul trucking trip and said that a rich white man in Florida offered to pay him to, quote, take care of his black wife in Georgia. At the time, Belinda didn't believe it. She thought he must be cheating on her.
Belinda thought that it was Tony just trying to get out of town and go down to Atlanta to the strip bars.
Until he took her to meet this rich white guy in a diner somewhere, and he got a wad full of money.
She says he sits down briefly in their booth and gives Tony Harwood the balance owed for the hit on the man's wife.
Belinda Trahan tells her boss that soon after this bizarre trip, she broke up with Tony Harwood and moved to Texas. But now, 11 years later, she says that he mysteriously reached out to her again, asking her to meet him at a nearby truck stop.
She's afraid that he may commit harm to her.
And it's this new tip from Belinda Trahan that sends Georgia authorities to the Lone Star State, turning up the heat on an otherwise cold case.
Georgia Bureau of Investigator Agent John Lang takes a detective from the Atlanta Police Department and goes down to Texas to talk to Belinda.
She was with Tony when they met this mysterious man at this diner that they were meeting at. We wanted to show her a lineup of pictures in hopes that she could pick Sullivan out of it.
And she takes her pink fingernail and taps right on Jim Sullivan's face and says, "This is the man."
My plan of attack was to get some recordings with her and Tony. So we got her to get in touch with Tony again.
She's talking to him and trying to coax information out of him, knowing John Lang is listening on her end. And Tony gives enough information that places him at the scene at the time.
We had the phone calls with Tony. She picked Jim Sullivan out of the lineup, but there was still more investigation to do. We really didn't know who Tony Harwood was.
John Lang knows that Tony worked at North American Van Lines. So he calls up North American Van Lines and he says, "Hey, you don't happen to have your records from 11 years ago?" And the guy says, "Yeah, there's some boxes full of files up in a musty attic. You're more than welcome to go poke around."
We went up into a hot attic and opened the first box that I went through. And about the third document I looked at was Jim Sullivan. His address was on it, Palm Beach, Florida. His signature was on it, and Tony Harwood's signature was on it.
He finds a bill of lading showing that Tony Harwood moved furniture for Jim Sullivan 2 months before the murder. And it's the paper trail he needs. It's like the jackpot.
Astounding. I don't know any other way to explain it. I mean, open this box and like the third record I look at, here it is. I mean, it just like it was meant to be.
On a Sunday morning in April of 1998, John Lang and local authorities go knock on Tony's door in Albemarle, North Carolina. Tony answers the door.
And he said, "You know, I've been waiting on you boys for a long time."
They take Tony to the Albemarle police station. Lang interviews Tony for 3 hours in this tiny room. But at the end of the day, Tony admits to taking money from Jim, $25,000, to take care of Lita. He also tells the detectives that he wasn't the one to pull the trigger, but that he was there the day of the murder.
He went through the whole case, and throughout the interview, he incriminated himself even more. I mean, admitted that he was there. He knew what happened. So he was arrested for murder of Lita Sullivan, and we took him back to Atlanta that day.
After Tony's arrest, things moved pretty quickly.
We are here today to announce the issuance of a warrant for the arrest of James V. Sullivan.
They got enough to get Sullivan, and now boom. Sullivan hears of this and blows. He takes off.
We have reason to believe that he's outside the country.
He's just gone, vanished.
Investigators say he could be anywhere.
He is nowhere to be found.
We certainly do not know where Mr. Sullivan is. We have reason to believe that he's outside the country.
More than a decade after his wife Lita was murdered, Jim Sullivan seems to be playing a game of catch me if you can with authorities.
There is an international manhunt for James Sullivan.
Well, Jim had moved to Costa Rica, actually bought a home there. In 1998, after an arrest warrant was issued for him, he immediately, like that night, went to Panama.
If you have any information concerning James Sullivan, you should contact the nearest U.S. Embassy or consulate.
We didn't know exactly where he had flown from Panama, and we didn't know exactly where he had gone.
His trail goes cold.
They put him on Interpol, and it was just cold.
They've tapped phone lines, anybody that he might have called, and he's called no one, not even his mother.
There was a few tips that came in. The tips are just dead ends.
The McClintons, they're dumbfounded that this guy could, get away again.
But in late 1999, with Sullivan still completely off the grid, the heartbroken Emery and Joanne McClinton do get some good news.
Last week came this, a court decision reinstating a $4 million judgment against Jim Sullivan in connection with a wrongful death case brought in effect by Lita's estate.
Lita's family and law enforcement officials hope that a renewed hunt for Sullivan's money will help smoke him out.
Where you find Sullivan's money, you're going to find him close by.
But even this goes nowhere.
Fast forward to 2002. There is no sign of Jim Sullivan.
We tried every effort in our arsenal to try and locate him, to put him on the FBI's wanted list, but to also put him on the top 10 list, which is very unusual. You don't get on the top 10 list very easily. Then we also featured him on America's Most Wanted.
The most recent picture we have of Sullivan is at least 5 years old, so the FBI age-enhanced this photo, which may bear a closer resemblance to Sullivan's appearance today. If you recognize James Sullivan from either of these photographs, call us now at 1-800-CRIME-TV.
A man sees America's Most Wanted on television and goes, I know that guy. He lives in my condo complex in Chiam, Thailand. And sure enough, he calls the authorities.
He went to Panama, to Venezuela, and eventually to Thailand, where he got a beachfront condo.
He spends his days walking on the beach, sitting by the pool, occasionally playing tennis, as though no other troubles in the world. The Thai police knock on Jim Sullivan's door on July 2nd, 2002, and say, you're under arrest. The McClintons can hardly believe it.
We found out from the FBI, and that was a moment of jubilation.
15 years is a long time to concentrate on the loss of a daughter. And we had determination, and we had the will. And we also had all of these individuals behind us.
Almost as soon as Jim Sullivan is arrested for murder, Tony Harwood, who has continued to deny being the trigger man, agrees to a plea deal.
Tony kind of sees the writing on the wall.
Harwood just decided that he would plead guilty, the negotiated plea for manslaughter, and that, in turn, that he would testify against Jim Sullivan.
It took 2 years, but he finally was extradited back to Atlanta in 2004.
He got off the plane. He was wearing a single shoe because he had such terrible gout in his foot. But he gets off and gets taken to Fulton County Jail. And there's this sort of cumulative sigh of relief.
To be clear, Sullivan being tried for murder in Georgia is not double jeopardy. For one thing, it is a state case, and the previous one was a federal case, and that specifically was for arranging Lita's murder for hire over the phone.
The elected district attorney appoints me along with a couple of other lawyers to prosecute the case.
This was a huge puzzle of a case.
Right.
How did your puzzle-solving skills come into play?
There's no cutting corners, and you spread the pieces out, and then you figure out what fits and what doesn't fit. And that's kind of what the prosecution of James Sullivan was like. It was putting together all these different pieces so that we could make sure that the prosecution of the case was done accurately and with integrity.
What concerned you going into this trial?
He was rich. He was a white male. He had escaped the federal authorities before, and he had two of the best criminal defense attorneys representing him.
They are sharp, and if they can find a way out, they're going to find a way out.
There will not be one shred of physical evidence that links Jim Sullivan to this crime.
Jim has eluded justice so many times that there's a real palpable fear that he's going to get away with it, that he's going to elude justice again.
After nearly 20 years, Jim Sullivan is finally on trial here in Fulton County for the murder of his wife, Lita. For her heartbroken parents, this day couldn't come soon enough.
The pain, believe it or not, it increases. It does not decrease. The shock decreases. The depression decreases. But the pain continues.
It was an A-team of prosecutors, great courtroom performers.
Clint Rucker was the lead prosecutor, and Anna Green, Kelly Hill, Sheila Ross.
And the evidence will show that the person who sent that hitman to Lita's door is the only person in the world who could have profited from her death. It is the only person in the world who met Tony Harwood and paid him off for killing her, and is the only person in the world who fled halfway around the world to avoid facing you.
Jury was 9 women and 3 men.
The jury is also racially mixed.
Jim Sullivan had Ed Garland and Don Samuel, again, the people who won that big courtroom victory against the feds.
What the state relies on is two types of evidence: circumstantial evidence, and then the testimony of con men.
The state initially started out the nature of the crime and what happened that morning.
I heard two sounds. They sounded to me like steel hitting steel.
I just didn't want to believe that it was a gun. And so I hesitated for a second, and then I really knew that it was a gun.
She was able to squeeze my hand each time I spoke with her, like she understood what I was saying. And for many, many years after this, I thought that's all it was. And then one day I realized that she was comforting me more than I was comforting her. That was the sort of lady I felt she was.
They had the phone calls that the FBI had found.
There was a call from this room to Mr. Sullivan's home at 7:44 in the morning.
But all this testimony notwithstanding, it's Belinda Trahan and Tony Harwood who everybody wants to hear from.
Belinda Trahan was the most important witness in the case.
He told me that some white guy who wanted to take out his black wife. I didn't believe it.
Why not?
I've been with him for 3 years, over 3 years. I mean, I figured he met someone because we were on the outs.
Most chilling about Belinda's testimony is that she confirms that there was at least one failed attempt on Lita's life.
She testifies that when Tony had gone to Lita's house on January 13th, then she didn't come to the door. They drove back to North Carolina and told Belinda that, it didn't work.
But Belinda testifies that hearing that from her boyfriend left her incredulous.
I said, just don't even lie to me. I said, because anyone knows that if you wanted to get a woman to answer the door, all you would have to do is take flowers to the door.
Did you in any way mean for that to be a suggestion as to how to get the job accomplished?
No, not at all.
Here's Belinda Trahan, and she is falling on the sword about what she did.
She suggested the flowers.
She suggested the flowers, and she admitted that on the stand.
You brought in the diner booth where they sat. Wow. Why couldn't you just tell the jury and show pictures?
I want you to see the puzzle once it's all put together. Yeah, I can show you the box. I can show you a photograph of it. But when I put it together and I show it to you, you'll never forget it.
Pushed the paper across the table like this, and then Tony put his hand on it and took it from there.
And there was a particular moment when she is asked to stand up in court and identified the person she witnessed give Tony Harwood an envelope full of money.
Please, point him out.
It's right there. He can't even make eye contact.
Your Honor, may the record reflect the witness has identified the defendant, James Sullivan.
But if prosecutors feel like Belinda Trahan's testimony is helping their case, they have to know that it's just as big a risk to put Tony Harwood on the stand.
Can you show the jurors the body language Mr. Sullivan used and the tone of voice, if it's possible, that he used when he was explaining to you that his wife, Lita, was a problem?
You know, I've got this wife of mine up in Atlanta, and she is just trying to take everything I've got. And I don't know what to do about it. I need someone to take care of my problem. Do you know anybody that can possibly take care of my problem for me? Because I need some help here.
We could prove Tony Harwood and James Sullivan actually met each other. So I spent the first part of Tony Harwood's examination confirming his signature on the hotel receipt.
And I put signature, Johnny Fur.
The fact that he actually went to the flower shop.
Who actually went inside the flower shop to purchase the flowers?
I did.
They had Tony Harwood saying that he was the one who made the collect call to Jim Sullivan's house.
What did you say to him?
I said, Merry Christmas. And he said, I understand. And that was it.
What were you trying to convey to Mr. Sullivan by giving him that signal, those code words?
That his problem was taken care of.
The defense had their chance to cross-examine Harwood. Not a single question. The two key witnesses were, of course, Belinda Trahan and Tony Harwood. And so, in closing arguments, the defense assailed their credibility.
You should reject everything that came out of his mouth. Harwood says envelope in the bathroom. She says an envelope at this booth over here.
Garland presents to the jury a letter-sized envelope stuffed with bills. Harwood had said it was all cash in $20 bills.
See, oops, some of it fell out, and some more. It won't fit in an envelope. The whole story just doesn't make sense.
In your closing arguments, you actually brought in a doorbell. Why? What was the point?
I wanted the jurors to have that sense of what Lita Sullivan experienced right before her murder.
An ordinary moment.
In an ordinary moment. The second reason why I did it is because James Sullivan liked to read books. And one of his favorite authors wrote a book called For Whom the Bell Tolls.
I'm going to ask you through your verdict of guilty to each and every count to tell James Vincent Sullivan for whom the bell tolls. Tell him that it tolls for thee. For you. For you.
And then I rang the doorbell 3 times.
As the jury goes out to deliberate, I think there's a real fear. Are they going to do it this time, or is it going to be like every other time?
I do not see this as a slam dunk for the state.
There's this anxiety. You're worried, but you're hopeful. I don't care who you talk to that does this kind of work as a litigator. They will tell you, oh, I can look at the jurors and I probably can tell you what they're going to do. No, you don't. You don't.
This is breaking news.
We do have breaking news at this hour. The jury having reached a verdict in the trial of Jim Sullivan.
The jury came back within a few hours on the same day.
It was so silent, and the tension was just palpable.
There's this anxiety. You don't know what it's going to be. You don't know how it's going to turn out. And you're worried, but you're hopeful.
It's hard not to think of Lita's family, her parents especially, after so many fits and starts to win justice for their firstborn child. It comes down to this moment.
The judge says,
"Ma'am, would you publish the verdict?"
And then from that moment until they get finished, nobody is breathing.
Count 1, malice murder. We, the jury, find the defendant, James Vincent Sullivan, guilty of malice murder.
I got a chance to hug Emory McClinton. I had never been hugged so tight before. This was his baby. And we had finally, after 19 years, brought that man a sense of satisfaction. I'll never forget it. The conviction of James Sullivan was the biggest puzzle that I had solved in my career. And it is one that gave me the most satisfaction that I had ever experienced as a prosecutor.
The court hears victim impact statements. What a loss it was to have Lita gone from their lives.
I dream of Lita often. She is smiling and walking in my direction, and I in hers. But we never reach each other.
The jury came back and gave him life in prison without the possibility of parole.
I am so very pleased, and I'm happy. What we were waiting for was something in our judicial system, something to happen and to bring it all together, and that's what you see today.
Why did it take 20 years, do you think?
It goes back to the resources.
He had privilege?
White privilege, completely. He knew how to manipulate people, and he had the resources to do that.
You've got a black victim, you've got a white defendant. Did race hover in this courtroom over this case at all?
I think in our criminal justice system, unfortunately, race always permeates throughout a case. But I'm thankful to say the evidence in the case overcame that racial component.
They never received any money. Is there money? Where is this money?
He's been able to secret his money. For the McClintons, seeing him rot in a prison in South Georgia brings them a whole lot more satisfaction.
This is a woman who you never met, I've never met, most of the people involved in this case never met her, and yet her life really made an impact. When somebody dies in this kind of manner, they don't stop being a member of the family, they don't stop being a member of the community, they never stop mattering.
David, Tony Harwood was released from prison in 2018 after serving his 20-year sentence. Jim Sullivan remains behind bars with no possibility of parole.
As for the other two men who were seen at that flower shop, no one else was ever charged. That is our program for tonight. Thanks for watching. I'm David Muir.
And I'm Deborah Roberts. From all of us here at 2020 and ABC News, good night.